Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. Mia's eyes were glued to the cash register screen as she scanned the last item of Mrs. Jenkins's grocery haul. The digital clock in the corner read 9:57 p.m., a mere 3 minutes away from sweet freedom. The fluorescent lights of the Walmart buzzed above, casting a harsh glow on the tired faces of the few remaining shoppers. The hum of the air conditioning was the only constant in the otherwise quiet store. Mrs. Jenkins chuckled as she swiped her credit card, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. You know, I used to work night shifts too, back when I was your age. You get used to the quiet eventually. Mia forced a smile. Yeah, I'm sure it'll grow on me. She didn't believe it, though. The stillness of the night always made her feel like something was waiting just outside the bright, safe bubble of the store, ready to pounce as soon as she stepped into the darkness. The beep of the card machine was drowned out by a sudden, ear-piercing siren that blared through the PA system, sending a shockwave of panic through the aisles. The lights flickered before switching to red emergency mode. The screens around the store flickered to life, displaying an eerie message. Emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Infection outbreak reported in the Detroit area. Stay indoors. Avoid contact with others. Further instructions will follow. The chatter of the shoppers grew frantic. Phones buzzed and beeped in unison as they all received the same message. The sliding doors parted with a hiss, and a wave of warm, sticky summer air rolled in. The customers' faces grew paler than the bleached white tiles as they read the text on their screens, confirming the horror playing out before their eyes. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the chaos unfold. People shoved carts aside, knocking over displays as they rushed for the exits. The siren outside grew louder, melding with the distant screams and honks of car horns. Mrs. Jenkins's hand trembled as she took her receipt. What on earth is happening? Mia had no answer. The only thing she knew for sure was that the quiet she'd dreaded had just become a whole lot more terrifying. A sudden crash echoed through the store, the sound of shattering glass cutting through the panic like a knife. The doors to the gardening section slammed open, and a group of people stumbled through, their faces contorted in rage. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, eyes glazed over with a madness that seemed to have swallowed any trace of humanity. One of them, a young man with a torn Walmart vest, lunged at a mother and her child. The woman's scream was abruptly silenced as the man's teeth sank into her neck. The little boy's eyes went wide with horror, and he took off running. The store descended into pandemonium as the infected swarmed in from the parking lot, attacking anyone they could grab hold of. Shrieks of terror filled the air, punctuated by the sickening sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping. Mia and Mrs. Jenkins stumbled back, knocking over a display of chips in their haste to get away from the bloodthirsty mob. They retreated towards the back of the store, trying to find a place to hide. The stockroom door slammed shut behind them, leaving them in a stark, cold silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the distant cries of the doomed. Mrs. Jenkins leaned against the metal shelves, her knees threatening to buckle. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mia took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for Mrs. Jenkins too. "We need to find the others," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "There must be a safe place in the store we can all go. Maybe the office." They tiptoed through the dimly lit aisles, the glow from the emergency lights casting long shadows. The smell of fresh soil and fertilizer mingled with the metallic scent of fear. They passed by rows of neatly stacked boxes, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos just beyond the stockroom walls. Mia's hand tightened around the heavy flashlight she'd grabbed from the shelf, the plastic cool against her sweaty palm. Every creak and groan of the ancient supermarket sent her heart racing, her imagination conjuring up monsters lurking in the darkened corners. But the real monsters were outside, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found their way in. Their steps grew heavier as they approached the office, the door hanging open like a gaping mouth. The sight that greeted them was grisly, the floor slick with blood, the walls spattered with it. The store manager lay sprawled across the floor, his eyes glassy and lifeless, the side of his head caved in. The infected had already been here. Mrs. Jenkins gagged, her hand flying to her mouth. Mia's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the employees who had taken shelter here. Her gaze fell upon a small, trembling figure huddled beneath the manager's desk. It was Steve, the night janitor. His eyes were wide with terror, but he was uninjured. They crouched beside him, whispering reassurances. "What happened?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Steve's eyes darted to the door before he spoke. "They got in. We tried to hold them off, but..." He swallowed hard. "They're everywhere." The sirens outside grew louder, and with them the moans of the infected grew closer. They had to move, find another place to hide. But where could they go now? The store had become a maze of danger, every aisle a potential death trap. And the infection, it spread with every bite. If they weren't careful, they could be the next to fall. Mia's mind raced as she peered into the darkness beyond the office. They had to find a way to survive this nightmare. And fast. "We need weapons," she murmured, her voice shaking slightly. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes darting around the room. "The sporting goods section," she suggested, her voice strained. "They have bats, maybe something sharper too." They helped Steve to his feet and moved with urgency towards the aisles, their flashlights cutting through the shadows like tiny beams of hope. The store's layout was a blur in Mia's mind as adrenaline surged through her veins. The world outside the cocoon of the stockroom had turned into a living hell, and she could feel the weight of every second that ticked by. As they reached the sporting goods, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder. They had to act quickly. Mia's hands trembled as she grabbed a baseball bat, feeling the solid weight of it in her grip. Mrs. Jenkins found a small knife in a camping display, while Steve took a crowbar that had been left behind by a fleeing customer. They armed themselves, ready to face the horrors that awaited them. They moved deeper into the store, passing the frozen foods section. The cold air that usually brought relief on a hot summer night now only served to remind Mia of the chill that had settled in her bones. The freezers hummed a mournful tune, the only sound in the eerie quiet, save for their footsteps echoing down the aisles. As they approached the electronics section, a figure stumbled into view. It was Karen, a cashier from Mia's shift, her eyes wild with fear. "They're coming," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "They're everywhere." Mia's heart skipped a beat. The infected had found their way in. They had to move now. The group huddled together, their makeshift weapons at the ready, and continued their desperate search for a safe haven. The tension grew thicker with each step, the air pregnant with the promise of a brutal encounter. A shiver ran down Mia's spine as she thought of the people she knew, her friends and colleagues, now possibly turned into the monsters that stalked the aisles. She clenched the bat tighter, her knuckles white. She was almost hysterical, the reality of the situation crashing down on her like a heavy fog. They had to find a place to hide, to regroup, and to figure out what the hell was happening outside. The trio pushed through the swinging doors that led to the employee break room, the faint scent of stale coffee and burnt microwave dinners now overpowered by the coppery tang of blood. The room was empty, thankfully, but the sight of an overturned chair and a smashed vending machine told a grisly story of a struggle. They locked the door behind them, their chests heaving with exertion and fear. For now, they were safe. But the horror was out there, and it was getting closer with every passing moment. They had to hold out, had to find a way to survive the night, and as they sat in the flickering light of the emergency lamp, Mia couldn't help but wonder if dawn would ever come. Steve spoke up, his voice strained. "We should try to get to the manager's office. There's a radio, a phone, a TV. Maybe we can find out what's happening, call for help." Mrs. Jenkins nodded in agreement, her eyes never leaving the crack under the door, watching for any sign of movement. "Good idea," she said, her voice shaky. "We might find something to protect ourselves better, too." They took a deep breath and stood up, their makeshift weapons in hand. The quiet was suffocating, the only sound the distant howling of the infected, growing closer. They approached the door with caution, listening for any sign of danger. Mia put her ear to the cold metal, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't hear anything," she whispered. They stepped out into the hallway, the lights above flickering in time with the sirens outside. The floor was sticky with something wet, and Mia tried not to think about what it might be. They moved swiftly but silently, their eyes peeled for any movement. The corridor was lined with photos of smiling employees, the sight of their carefree expressions a stark contrast to the nightmare unfolding before them. The office was just around the corner, but it might as well have been miles away. They turned the corner, and there it was, the manager's office, a beacon of hope in the sea of chaos. The door was closed, the wood marred with deep gouges as if something had been trying to get in, or out. Mrs. Jenkins tried the handle, her hand shaking. It was locked. "We need to find the key," she murmured. Mia scanned the area, her eyes falling on a set of keys hanging from a hook on the wall. She moved towards it, her heart racing. If they could get into the office, they could radio for help, call the police, do something, anything. Her hand reached out and plucked the keys from the hook, the metal cold and comforting in her palm. She held her breath as she inserted the largest one into the lock, twisted it, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a mess of overturned furniture and scattered papers, but the radio, phone, and TV were all intact. They rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound of the lock clicking into place was music to their ears. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to believe that they might just make it through this hellish night. But outside, the screams grew louder, a grim reminder that their battle for survival had only just begun. Mia's eyes immediately darted to the security monitors on the wall, displaying a series of grainy, black and white images of the store's interior. The screens flickered with the movements of the infected as they prowled the aisles, seeking out the last vestiges of human life. The sight of their former colleagues and customers being overwhelmed by the crazed mob was almost too much to bear. Steve moved closer to the monitors, his eyes scanning the screens with a newfound sense of urgency. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the feed from the parking lot. "Some of the cars are still running." Mrs. Jenkins gasped. Could we get out that way?" Mia felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "If we can sneak outside without them seeing us, maybe we can get to one of those cars and get out of here." They studied the monitors intently, plotting a path through the carnage to the exit doors. The infected moved in erratic patterns, driven by a primal hunger that seemed to override any semblance of strategy. But as they watched, the group saw that some of the survivors had banded together, fighting back with whatever they could grab. The scene was grim, but it wasn't entirely hopeless. Karen joined them, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm. "We're going to get to those cars. We have to stick together and stay quiet. Can you do that?" Karen nodded, gripping the bat that Mia had handed her tightly. They had formed a makeshift family of survivors, bound by fear and the desperate need to live. They moved quickly, staying low and close to the walls, using the shelves for cover. The floor was slick with a mix of sweat and blood, making every step treacherous. They could hear the snarls and growls of the infected growing closer, feel the heat of their breath as they passed the end of each aisle. The exit doors loomed ahead, a beacon of salvation in the sea of horror. They had made it to the front of the store without encountering the infected, but as they approached the doors, they heard a commotion from the parking lot. More of the creatures had arrived, drawn by the noise and the smell of fear. Mia's heart hammered in her chest as she peered through the glass. The cars they'd seen were surrounded, their engines purring tantalizingly. The keys to the office had unlocked the door to the outside world, but it was clear that the escape route wasn't going to be as simple as they'd hoped. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but the alternative was to wait here and become the hunted. They exchanged a silent look of understanding. There was no turning back now. They had to fight their way through this horde, or die trying. Gripping their weapons, they took a moment to collect themselves, bracing for the battle ahead. The door creaked open, and the night air rushed in, thick with the stench of decay. The infected turned as one, their eyes locking onto the fresh meat that had just presented itself. Mia took the lead, swinging her bat with a ferocity born of desperation. The first few swings connected, knocking back the nearest attackers. But for every one they took down, more took their place. The parking lot was a maelstrom of flailing limbs and snapping teeth. They had to keep moving, had to get to the cars. The headlights pierced the gloom, offering a path through the chaos. Mrs. Jenkins stumbled, a hand reaching out to grab Mia's arm. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm too old for this." Mia's eyes never left the horde. "You can," she said fiercely. "You have to." With renewed determination, the trio pushed forward, dodging and weaving through the mass of infected. The sound of breaking glass and distant wails grew closer, hinting at the chaos that had overtaken the city beyond the confines of the store. They had almost reached the cars when Mia saw it, a flash of blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. Her heart leaped with hope. The wail of sirens grew louder, and she squinted to make out the shapes of 4 police officers, guns drawn, fighting off the infected with a precision that spoke of grim experience. "Police!" one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of the night. "This way!" They sprinted towards the officers, the promise of rescue a tantalizing mirage. The officers formed a protective barricade around them, firing shots that rang out like a war zone. The infected fell back, but not without taking a few bullets. The officers herded them into a waiting SUV, the engine purring with the promise of escape. But as they neared the vehicle, Mrs. Jenkins' legs gave out beneath her. She fell with a cry, her frail body no match for the adrenaline that had fueled their desperate flight. Before Mia could react, 2 of the infected broke through the officers' defenses and descended upon her. Mia's scream was lost in the roar of gunfire as the officers tried to fend off the attackers. Steve dove forward using his crowbar to beat back the creatures, but it was too late. The infected had latched onto Mrs. Jenkins' arm, tearing through the thin fabric of her sleeve, revealing the delicate, vulnerable flesh beneath. With a snarl, one of the officers stepped forward, aiming his gun at the monsters feasting on their new prey. The shots rang out, and the infected stumbled, releasing their grip. But the damage was done. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes rolled back in her head, and a trickle of blood spilled from her mouth. The horror was too much for Mia to process. The remaining officers ushered them into the SUV, their expressions grim. "We have to go," the one in the driver's seat said, his voice tight with urgency. "There are more of them coming." The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle lurched forward, tires screeching on the asphalt. Mia stared out the window, watching the Walmart shrink into the distance. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she looked over to see Steve, his face etched with pain and determination. They had lost Mrs. Jenkins, but they were still alive. But then, a twisted shadow emerged from the store's entrance, moving with a jerky, inhuman gait. Mia's heart stopped as she recognized the blue cardigan and gray hair of the woman who had been so kind to her. Mrs. Jenkins was on her feet, her eyes now glazed and hungry. The infection had claimed her. Mia's scream pierced the air, her body convulsing with sobs. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The woman who had offered her comfort, who had become a beacon of hope in this nightmare, was now one of them. She pounded the window, the glass cold and unyielding under her fists. "No, no, no!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse with grief. The officers exchanged a worried glance, their own fears mirrored in their eyes. They knew they had to keep moving, but the sight of Mrs. Jenkins was too much for Mia to handle. She collapsed into a heap on the floor of the car, her cries echoing through the cabin as they sped away from the scene of carnage. The SUV jolted and swerved around abandoned cars, the world outside a blur of shadow and light. The radio crackled with static, the occasional voice cutting through the noise, but the messages were garbled, filled with panic and despair. The city of Detroit had become a battleground for the survival of the fittest, and it was clear that the infected had the upper hand. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. "Danielle, grab the snacks. I'll get the drinks," Damon called out as they prepared for their weekly movie night. The twins had spent countless evenings like this in their cramped apartment in Detroit, sharing laughs and popcorn, escaping the grind of their jobs. The fridge hummed in the background as Damon opened it, the coolness washing over his face like a small oasis. He grabbed 2 cans of soda and turned around to see Danielle frozen, staring at their neighbor's door. It was slightly ajar, the muffled sounds of a disturbance seeping through. "You okay, Danny?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Her eyes remained glued to the door, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Did you hear that?" Damon cocked his head, tuning into the faint noises. It was definitely more than their usual rowdy neighbors. It sounded like someone was in trouble. He stepped closer to the door and peered through the crack. In the dimly lit hallway, he saw a blur of movement and a flash of teeth. "Danielle, get back!" Before he could react, a hand burst through the neighbor's door, clawing at the air. Danielle dropped the snacks and sprinted to the living room. The creature that had once been Mr. Jenkins stumbled into their apartment, eyes wild with infection. Its skin was mottled and pale, and its teeth were bared like a rabid animal's. Damon's heart hammered in his chest as he slammed the door shut and locked it, pushing a chair against it for good measure. They both stared at each other in disbelief, their laughter from moments ago a distant memory. "What the hell is going on?" Danielle whispered, her voice shaking. The pounding grew louder, the creature on the other side more insistent. "We have to get out of here," Damon said, his eyes searching the room for anything that could serve as a weapon. He spotted the baseball bat they used to scare off the local thugs. "Take this," he said, handing it to Danielle. "We need to get to the car and drive to the suburbs before they block off the city." They could hear more commotion from the hallway, the sound of other doors being broken down. "The infection is spreading," Danielle murmured, her grip tightening around the bat. "We can't stay here." Damon nodded, his mind racing. The TV in the corner flickered to life, displaying the local news. The anchorman's voice was frantic. "We're receiving reports of unexplained violent behavior across the city. Authorities urge residents to stay inside and avoid contact with others. The National Guard has been called in." The siblings exchanged a terrified glance. "We have to move now," Damon said, his voice low and urgent. They took a deep breath, then bolted for the front door. The creature outside their apartment had gone eerily quiet. Damon yanked the chair away and threw the door open, ready to fight if necessary. The hallway was empty, the smell of fear and sickness lingering in the stifling heat. They tiptoed down the stairs, the tension thick in the air. Every creak echoed like a gunshot, making their hearts race. The lobby's glass doors stood open, the night outside a stark contrast to the chaos within. They stepped out into the parking lot, the sound of distant sirens piercing the quiet. A few infected staggered in the distance, but they were too preoccupied with their own hunt to notice the twins. Damon's car, a beaten-up old Honda, was parked under a flickering streetlight. They sprinted towards it, the heat from the asphalt burning through their sneakers. As they approached, they saw a shadowy figure slumped over the hood. "Must be a drunk," Damon murmured, his grip on the bat tightening. As they got closer, the figure jolted upright, revealing the grotesque visage of Mrs. Rodriguez, their landlord's wife. Her eyes were sunken, her skin slack with infection. She lunged at them with a guttural scream, her teeth snapping like a wild animal's. Danielle swung the bat with surprising force, knocking her back. They scrambled into the car, slammed the doors, and locked themselves in. Damon fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally inserting them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, drowning out the creature's cries. They peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. The siblings didn't dare look back, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. They drove through the deserted streets, the occasional shadow flitting past the car windows. The city felt eerily silent, save for the distant wails of sirens and the occasional growl of a transformed human. Danielle's knuckles were white on the baseball bat, her eyes darting from side to side. "We have to hurry," she murmured. "They're gonna lock us in." Damon nodded, his jaw clenched as he steered through the urban maze. The GPS on his phone directed them to the nearest highway, but the route was blocked by a swarm of infected. "We'll have to find another way," he said through gritted teeth. The car's air conditioning was a lifeline in the suffocating heat, but it couldn't chill the panic rising in their chests. They turned down a side street, narrowly avoiding a group of infected that stumbled into their path. The buildings grew closer together, casting deep shadows that seemed to hide more dangers. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the grim faces of the once human monsters. Damon's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated the maze of streets. His mind raced with the thought of their family in the suburbs, oblivious to the horror unfolding in the city. "We have to call Mom and Dad," he said, reaching for his phone. "No signal," Danielle replied, her voice tight with fear. "The lines are probably jammed." "We'll just have to get there and warn them in person," Damon said, his eyes never leaving the road. The cityscape grew more and more alien as they drove deeper into the night. The once familiar streets of Detroit were now a minefield of danger, each turn bringing new horrors into view. Danielle spotted a small convenience store up ahead, its lights flickering. "We need supplies," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't just drive out without anything." Damon nodded, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "Stay in the car," he ordered, pocketing the keys. "If anything happens, start the engine and drive." With the bat in hand, he stepped out into the oppressive heat, the asphalt sticking to his shoes like tar. The convenience store's door hung off its hinges, a gaping mouth to the darkened interior. The bell jingled faintly as he pushed it open, the chime a sad reminder of the mundane routines now shattered by chaos. Inside, the shelves were overturned, aisles littered with debris. The smell of spoiled milk and fear hung heavy in the air. Damon's heart thudded in his chest as he moved swiftly, grabbing water bottles, snacks, and a flashlight from a rack near the counter. The sound of shuffling feet made him freeze. A figure emerged from the back, a man he recognized as the cashier, now with the same feral gaze as the rest. The man lunged, but Damon was ready. He swung the bat with all his might, connecting with the side of the infected man's head. The sickening crunch echoed through the small store, and the man crumpled to the floor. Danielle's face paled as she watched from the car, but she knew they had no choice. They couldn't risk getting stuck without supplies. Damon dashed back to the car, tossing the supplies into the back seat. "Let's go," he shouted, jumping in and peeling out of the parking lot. They drove on, the city's lights fading into the dark horizon. The radio crackled with static, the occasional burst of a newscast offering grim updates. The infection was spreading rapidly, and the National Guard had indeed set up blockades around the city. The siblings took a moment to catch their breath, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. "We need to find another way out," Danielle said, her eyes on the map spread out on her lap. "We can't go through the main routes." Damon nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. "We'll take the back roads. It'll take longer, but it's safer." Their journey through the abandoned streets was fraught with tension. Every shadow, every sudden movement had them on edge. They saw more and more infected as they approached the city's outskirts, their numbers growing denser as the buildings grew taller. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and desperation. The car's fuel gauge was dangerously low, a constant reminder of the dwindling time they had before they'd be stranded. "We need to find gas," Danielle said, her voice tight with anxiety. Damon nodded, his eyes darting from side to side as they passed a deserted gas station. They ventured down a side street and found a smaller, less conspicuous gas station. The lights were out, but the pumps were still standing. They pulled in, the car's engine ticking as it cooled. "Stay here, keep the doors locked," Damon instructed, grabbing the bat. He stepped out into the quiet, the hum of the car's engine the only sound in the night. The air was thick with the stench of decay. He approached the pumps, checking the nozzles for signs of tampering. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed from the alley beside the station. A figure stumbled into view, its eyes gleaming with infection. Damon's heart leaped into his throat as he swung the bat, catching the creature in the side. It stumbled, but didn't fall. He hit it again, harder this time, and it crumpled to the ground with a sickening thump. The twins watched it, panting, until they were sure it wasn't getting up. Then, with trembling hands, he filled the car's tank. They were about to leave when they heard a soft whimper coming from the gas station's office. A small girl no older than 10 was huddled under the counter, her eyes wide with fear. "Hey," Danielle said softly, unlocking the car door. "It's okay, we're here to help." The girl looked up, her cheeks stained with tears. "Please, take me with you," she pleaded. Damon and Danielle exchanged a look. They hadn't anticipated this, but in the face of the innocent child, they couldn't just leave her to the mercy of the infected. "Okay," Danielle said gently. "Come on, we're getting out of here." The girl, whose name they learned was Lily, clutched a small teddy bear to her chest as they squeezed her into the back seat. her wide eyes never leaving their faces. They sped away from the gas station, the tires squealing as they turned onto the main road, their path now illuminated by the flickering flames of burning cars in the distance. "We can't take the highway," Damon said, his voice tight. "It's swarming with them." Danielle nodded, her eyes glued to the road ahead. They had been driving for hours, weaving through the outskirts of Detroit, trying to avoid the main roads. The car's headlights pierced the darkness, revealing the occasional twitch of an infected figure in the shadows. The silence in the car was suffocating, punctuated only by the soft whimpers of the frightened girl in the back. As they approached a small bridge, they saw a roadblock. The National Guard had arrived earlier than they expected. "Damn it," Damon swore under his breath, slamming the steering wheel. "We have to find another way." Danielle's eyes searched the map in the flickering light from the dashboard. "There's a back road," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not much, but it might get us around." Damon nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. They turned down the narrow road, the car's headlights cutting through the inky darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The dense forest loomed on either side, a wall of shadows that seemed to close in around them. The GPS beeped, indicating a sharp turn. As the car swung around, a figure stumbled into the beam of light, its arms outstretched. Danielle screamed, but Damon's reflexes took over. He swerved, narrowly missing the infected man, who stumbled and fell into the ditch. The car skidded to a stop, the siblings' hearts racing. "What do we do?" Danielle whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Damon's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he peered through the windshield. "We keep going," he said firmly. "We can't help everyone." They drove on, the tension in the car thick enough to slice with a knife. The narrow road grew more treacherous, the headlights casting eerie shadows through the trees. Lily's whimpers grew louder, the teddy bear a pitiful shield against the horror outside. Danielle reached back to comfort her, her hand shaking slightly. "It's okay," she murmured. "We're gonna get you somewhere safe." The GPS squawked again, the robotic voice a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over them. "In 200 feet, turn left," it instructed. Damon's eyes darted to the side mirror, watching the infected stagger closer. The bridge was now blocked from view, but the sound of their approach grew louder. "Damon, go!" Danielle urged, her voice tight with fear. He floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The headlights bobbed up and down as the Honda's suspension took the brunt of the uneven road. The bridge grew closer, the shadows of the infected gaining on them. Danielle glanced at the gas gauge. It hovered just above empty. "We won't make it," she murmured. Damon's eyes never left the road, his jaw clenched. "We have to," he said through gritted teeth. The engine whined as they approached the bridge. The twins could see the silhouettes of the National Guard's vehicles in the distance, the headlights blinking like a macabre beacon of hope. The bridge creaked under the weight of the car as they crossed, the river below a silent witness to the chaos above. The sound of the infected grew fainter, but the danger was far from over. They had no idea what awaited them on the other side of the city limits. The GPS directed them through a series of sharp turns, the car's tires screeching in protest as they weaved through the dark, desolate landscape. As they approached the first checkpoint, the headlights illuminated a grim scene. The National Guard had set up a perimeter, their faces a mix of fear and determination. They held their guns at the ready, their eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of the infected. Damon rolled down the window, his hands raised in a sign of peace. "We're not infected," he called out. "We have a little girl with us." The soldiers approached cautiously, their faces obscured by helmets and gas masks. One shone a light into the car, the beam dancing over Danielle's terrified expression and the trembling form of Lily in the back seat. After a tense moment, the leader nodded. "Follow the convoy," he barked. "We're evacuating the last few to the safe zone." The siblings' relief was palpable as they fell in line behind the military vehicles, the headlights painting the road in a conga line of light and shadow. They drove in silence, the rumble of the engines and the occasional distant scream the only sounds piercing the night. The safe zone was a beacon in the distance, the lights from the barracks growing brighter with each passing minute. As they neared the checkpoint, Danielle turned to look at Lily, her eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard. "You're gonna be okay," she whispered, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The girl's eyes searched hers, desperate for reassurance. "We're almost there." The convoy of military vehicles grew closer to the safe zone, their headlights cutting through the inky blackness like a knife through butter. The twins could see the barbed wire fences and armed guards waiting for them, a stark contrast to the quiet suburban streets they knew. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. In the sweltering embrace of a Detroit summer evening, Larry McDonald ambled through the deserted streets. His worn-out baseball cap shielded his sweat-drenched forehead, and the fading light cast elongated shadows that danced alongside him. Larry, a middle-aged man with a penchant for old rock music, had spent the day rummaging through the dusty aisles of a second-hand record store. His prize of the day, a rare vinyl of Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti, was tucked safely under his arm. The city's usual buzz had been replaced by an eerie silence that made the sticky air feel heavier, the buildings seem taller. The first indication of trouble was the distant sound of sirens, a pattern of chaos that grew louder with each step Larry took toward home. He quickened his pace, the anticipation of a cold beer and the comfort of his couch propelling him forward. As he approached the corner of 8 Mile Road and Woodward Avenue, Larry saw a commotion up ahead. A group of people, their faces twisted in rage, chased a terrified young woman. They moved with a disturbing erratic gait, as if their bodies were controlled by some malevolent force. Larry froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman's screams pierced the quietude, and suddenly one of the pursuers lunged at her, biting down with a ferocity that was almost inhuman. She crumpled to the ground, and in a heartbeat, the others descended upon her. Panic bubbled in Larry's chest. He knew he had to get out of there fast. He turned to retreat, only to find himself face to face with a man whose eyes were glazed over with a sickly film. The man's teeth were bared, and his breath reeked of rotten meat. Without warning, he lunged. Larry's survival instincts kicked in, and he swung the vinyl album like a frisbee, catching the attacker's head with a resounding crack. The man staggered back, allowing Larry to sprint away. The chilling realization dawned on him that this was no ordinary assault. Something was infecting the people of Detroit, turning them into mindless predators. As he ran, Larry's thoughts raced. He had to warn someone, had to get help. He fumbled with his phone, trying to dial 911, but the call dropped out. He glanced over his shoulder to find the streets now filled with these infected creatures, staggering toward him. The sirens grew closer, but they brought no comfort, only a sense of dread. The National Guard must have been called in to contain the outbreak. He ducked into an alley, his breath ragged and the vinyl clutched tightly to his chest. The shadows grew darker, and the alley grew narrower until it was barely wide enough to fit his shoulders. Larry heard the shuffling of feet behind him, the guttural growls of the pursuers growing louder. His heart hammered in his ears as he stumbled upon a metal gate leading to a backyard. With a desperate heave, he flung it open and slipped through, the clang of metal reverberating through the alley like a gunshot. The backyard was a small, fenced-in oasis, the scent of blooming lilacs overpowered by the stench of decay. A dilapidated house loomed over him, its windows boarded up, a silent sentinel to the horror unfolding outside. Larry's eyes scanned the area for any sign of refuge, spotting a tool shed with a rusted lock. He sprinted to it, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, giving him the strength to smash the lock with a nearby brick. The shed door creaked open, revealing a dark, cramped space filled with cobwebs and forgotten garden tools. He stepped inside, the door scraping shut behind him, and crouched down, panting. The thud of the creature's footsteps grew closer, their snarling a chorus of hunger echoing through the alley. Larry pressed his back against the damp wood, his heart thundering in his chest. The shed's darkness enveloped him, a stark contrast to the bright summer evening just outside. He could feel their presence, almost taste their rabid breaths as they prowled the perimeter of the fence, seeking their prey. The sirens grew to a fever pitch, the National Guard's arrival imminent. He knew he had to move before the area was locked down. Forcing his breaths to steady, Larry took stock of the shed's contents. His eyes fell upon a pair of rusty garden shears. The metal was dull, but the points looked sharp enough to serve as a weapon. He gripped the worn handle tightly, feeling the rough edges dig into his palm. It was a poor defense against the horrors outside, but it was all he had. The snarling grew more intense, the frenzied mob seemingly aware of his hiding place. Larry could almost feel their hunger seeping through the cracks in the wood. He knew he had to get to the suburbs, where hopefully his family and friends had escaped the madness. If he didn't, he might be trapped in the city, surrounded by these infected monsters. Summoning his courage, Larry peeked through a crack in the shed door. The alley was a sea of flailing limbs and snapping jaws, the infected stumbling over each other in a frenetic dance of bloodlust. The sirens had reached a crescendo, the flashing lights of military vehicles casting a strobe-like glow on the chaotic scene. The National Guard was setting up barricades, sealing off the city. His window of escape was rapidly closing. With a deep breath, Larry pushed open the shed door a fraction. The creature's attention swiveled to him like a horde of sharks scenting blood. He stepped out, the garden shears held before him like a cross against vampires. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, the heat of the evening trapping the smell in a suffocating embrace. Larry's skin crawled as the creature's eyes locked onto him, their pupils dilated with hunger. He bolted, sprinting through the alley, the thunder of his heart drowning out the sirens. The creatures followed, their shuffling footsteps growing louder, more insistent. As Larry emerged onto Woodward Avenue, he saw the National Guard setting up a barricade a few blocks away. The soldiers were in full gear, their faces grim as they fired warning shots into the air. Larry's hopes soared for a brief moment before plummeting. The infected had spotted the military presence and were converging on it, a tidal wave of chaos and violence. The soldiers struggled to hold the line, their rifles firing in controlled bursts. The sound of gunfire melded with the anguished cries of the infected, creating a symphony of horror that pierced the night. He knew he had to act fast. Darting through the shadows, Larry weaved through the outskirts of the chaos, using the distraction to his advantage. Each step brought him closer to the barricade, but also closer to the ravenous mob. The heat from their bodies washed over him, the stench of decay a constant reminder of what they had become. His mind raced with the possibility of infection. A single bite could mean a fate worse than death. As he approached the barricade, a soldier's gaze fell on him. The young man's eyes widened in a mix of horror and fear before he called out, "Sir, stop! Don't come any closer." Larry paused, the garden shears still clutched in his hand, his chest heaving. He knew he looked suspicious, but he had to get through. He shouted back, "I'm not one of them. I need help." The soldier took a step closer, his rifle pointed at Larry's chest. "Drop your weapon and put your hands up." Larry's grip on the shears tightened, but he knew he had no choice. He slowly bent down and placed them on the ground, raising his hands in the air. The infected were now only a few houses away, their moans a crescendo of terror. "Please let me through. I'm not infected." Larry begged, his voice cracking with desperation. The soldier looked at him with a mix of doubt and empathy, sweat glistening on his forehead. "We have orders to shoot on sight," he replied, his voice strained, "but I'll radio for a medical team to check you out." The sound of the approaching mob grew louder, their groans echoing off the buildings like a macabre chant. Larry's eyes darted from the soldier to the barricade and back, his mind racing. "There's no time for that," he yelled. "They're almost here. You have to trust me." The soldier's expression shifted, his eyes flicking between the horde and Larry. The line was holding for now, but the creature's numbers were overwhelming. He took a deep breath and made a split-second decision. "Go! Run for it. We'll cover your retreat." With a nod of gratitude, Larry took off, sprinting towards the barricade. The soldier's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Open the gate! Incoming civilian!" Bullets whizzed by as the National Guard laid down covering fire, dropping several infected that had breached the alley's mouth. Larry felt the heat of their passing, a stark reminder of his precarious situation. The gate to the suburbs beckoned, a symbol of safety just within his grasp. As he approached, the gate began to swing open. The soldiers' faces were etched with urgency, their eyes never leaving the horde that grew ever closer. Larry's legs burned with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The gap between him and the barricade grew smaller with every step, hope swelling in his chest. The first infected creature broke through the alley, its eyes locking onto him with a feral intensity. Larry pushed himself harder, his legs feeling like lead. The soldier beside the gate leveled his rifle, firing into the creature's chest. It stumbled but did not fall. Another round to the head dropped it like a stone. "Hurry!" the soldier yelled, his voice strained. The barricade was now just a few feet away. Larry could see the sweat on the soldiers' faces, their fear palpable despite their discipline. He threw himself through the opening, the gate slamming shut behind him with a thunderous clang. The soldiers quickly secured it, the metal bars groaning under the weight of the infected pressing against it. The creature's clawing hands and snapping teeth filled the air with a cacophony of rage. Panting heavily, Larry looked around. The suburbs were eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the chaos trapped on the other side of the barricade. He was safe for now, but the horror of the city was a stark reminder of what awaited him if he didn't find refuge. He stumbled away from the gate, the garden shears forgotten on the ground. The National Guard's compound was a few miles away, a bastion of safety in the spreading pandemonium. The suburban streets stretched out like a ghost town, the occasional flicker of candlelight in a window hinting at the terrified residents huddled inside. Larry's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. His first priority was to find his family, but without a working phone or any news, he had no idea where to start. The distant rumble of military vehicles grew louder, signaling that the quarantine was being enforced with a heavy hand. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. The bass from Club Infinity rattled the windows of nearby buildings along 8 Mile Road, its rhythm a familiar heartbeat in Detroit's restless night. Kendall Matthews stood at the bar, his muscular frame tensed as he watched the growing confrontation on the dance floor. As the leader of the East Side Kings, he'd learned to spot trouble before it erupted. Tonight, Trouble wore a stained white t-shirt and moved with an unnatural jerkiness that set off all his alarms. "Something's wrong with that dude," Corey Wilson muttered beside him. Kendall's right-hand man fingered the knife in his pocket, a nervous habit from their shared years on the streets. The man in question swayed near the center of the dance floor, bumping aggressively into other patrons. His skin had a sickly gray pallor under the strobing lights, and dark sweat stained his shirt despite the club's air conditioning. As Kendall watched, the man lurched into a young woman, causing her to spill her drink. "Hey!" Her boyfriend stepped forward, pushing the stranger back. "Watch yourself." The man's response was immediate and horrifying. He lunged forward with impossible speed, sinking his teeth into the boyfriend's neck. Blood sprayed across nearby dancers, who screamed and scrambled back. The girlfriend's shriek cut through the music like a knife. "Holy shit," Corey breathed, already moving forward. But Kendall grabbed his arm. "Wait," he ordered, eyes narrowing as the bitten man staggered, clutching his neck. Something was happening, something wrong. The victim's movements became jerky, spasmodic. Within seconds, he turned and attacked his own girlfriend, tearing into her arm with savage intensity. The club erupted into chaos. People rushed toward the exits, trampling each other in their panic. Kendall spotted Aaron Cruz, leader of the rival West Side crew, moving through the crowd with his lieutenant Christopher "Ghost" Rodriguez. Their eyes met across the room, decades of territory disputes and bad blood hanging between them. "We need to move," Corey urged, but Kendall was watching the growing number of infected. The original attacker had bitten 3 more people, and each victim turned within minutes, joining the frenzy. They moved with a predatory coordination that sent chills down Kendall's spine. The club's bouncer, Bobby Thompson, tried to intervene. Built like a linebacker, Bobby had broken up hundreds of fights during his tenure. But his size meant nothing as 5 infected swarmed him simultaneously. His screams joined the cacophony of terror. The back exit, Kendall decided, grabbing Corey's shoulder, through the kitchen. They fought their way through the panicking crowd. Near the bar, Kendall spotted Maria Suarez, a trauma nurse who ran the free clinic in his territory. She was helping Paula Chen, one of the club's regular bartenders, climb over the bar to escape an infected patron. "Maria!" Kendall called out. "This way!" Maria looked up, her medical training evident in her calculated movements. She helped Paula over the bar, then grabbed a bottle of vodka and a lighter. As an infected woman lunged at them, Maria created an improvised flamethrower, driving the attacker back with a stream of burning alcohol. "Damn," Corey whispered admiringly. "That's hot." "Focus," Kendall snapped, though he had to admit it was impressive. They reached the kitchen doors just as Aaron and Christopher arrived with their crew member Lorna Rodriguez, no relation to Ghost. The 2 gang leaders exchanged tense looks. "Temporary truce?" Aaron proposed, his voice tight as more screams erupted from the main room. Kendall nodded curtly. "Until we're clear." The kitchen was a maze of stainless steel and shadows. Paula, who knew the layout, took the lead. "Loading docks through here," she directed, moving between prep stations. "There's a security door." A figure burst from the walk-in freezer, one of the kitchen staff, but his eyes were wild, blood dripping from his mouth. Christopher reacted first, shoving Lorna behind him as he drew his gun. The shot rang off the metal walls, catching the infected man in the chest. He stumbled but didn't fall. "The head!" Maria shouted. "Aim for the head!" Christopher's second shot went through the infected man's forehead, dropping him instantly. But the noise had drawn attention. Shadows moved beyond the kitchen doors as more infected approached, drawn by the gunshot. "Doors locked," Paula called from the loading dock entrance. "Need the code." "Move," Lorna ordered, pulling lock-picking tools from her jacket. Her fingers flew over the electronic keypad, bypassing the security system with practiced ease. The door clicked open just as the kitchen doors burst inward. The scene that followed would haunt Kendall's nightmares for years. Infected poured into the kitchen like a wave of rabid humanity. Their movements had evolved in the short time since the initial attack, becoming more coordinated, more tactical. They used the kitchen islands for cover, working to cut off escape routes. "Go!" Kendall shoved Maria and Paula through the door. Corey laid down covering fire, his shots echoing in the confined space. Aaron and Christopher backed up the stairs to the loading dock, while Lorna held the door. But they weren't all going to make it. Kendall could see that already. The infected were too many, too fast, and too smart. They needed a distraction. "Get them out of here," he told Corey, grabbing a large pot from a nearby counter. "I'll draw them off." Like hell, Corey started to argue, but Kendall was already moving. He slammed the pot against the metal shelving units, creating a thunderous racket that drew the infected's attention. "Come on, you hungry bastards!" He backed toward a different door, leading to the club's offices. "Fresh meat right here!" The infected swarmed toward him as the others escaped through the loading dock. Kendall caught a glimpse of Maria's horrified face before Corey pulled her away. Then he was running through dark hallways, the sound of pursuit close behind. The office area was a maze of cubicles and file cabinets. Kendall weaved through them, knocking over shelves to slow his pursuers. He could hear them communicating, not with words, but with a series of clicks and growls that suggested developing intelligence. They were learning, coordinating their movements to cut off his escape routes. He burst into the manager's office, slamming and locking the door behind him. A window overlooked the back alley, 2 stories up. Not an ideal escape route, but better than the alternative. As he moved toward it, his phone buzzed. A text from Corey. "Made it to Maria's clinic. Whole neighborhood's going crazy. Where are you?" Before Kendall could respond, something massive slammed against the office door. The wood cracked but held. Another impact followed immediately, more coordinated than the first. They were working together now, synchronizing their attacks. Kendall typed quickly, "Stay there. Something's wrong with them. They're changing." The door exploded inward as Kendall reached the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. The infected moved like a single organism, flowing into the room with horrific grace. At their head was Bobby, the bouncer's massive frame now twisted by mutation. His muscles had grown grotesquely, skin split in places to reveal pulsing tissue beneath. But it was his eyes that struck Kendall. They showed intelligence, calculation, hunger. "Oh shit!" Kendall breathed. Then he dove through the window as Bobby charged. Glass shattered around him as he fell. The alley rushed up to meet him, promising either escape or a quick end. Kendall tucked and rolled, decades of parkour practice taking over. He hit the ground hard but managed to turn it into a roll that carried him back to his feet. Pain lanced through his shoulder, probably dislocated. But there was no time to deal with it. Above, infected poured from the broken window like a waterfall of corrupted humanity. They moved with impossible agility, some using the walls to slow their descent. Kendall ran. The streets of Detroit had never felt more alien. Cars burned at random intervals, casting everything in flickering orange light. Screams echoed from all directions as the infection spread through the densely packed neighborhood. But worse were the sounds of coordination. Whistles and clicks that suggested the infected were communicating, organizing. He reached Maria's clinic 20 minutes later, his lungs burning and shoulders screaming in protest. Corey let him in through a heavily barricaded door, quickly securing it behind them. "Jesus, you made it," Corey breathed, pulling him into a quick embrace. "We thought—" "They're evolving," Kendall cut him off, addressing the room at large. Maria had converted her clinic into a makeshift command center. Aaron and his people huddled near a window, weapons ready. Paula and Lorna worked on barricading another entrance, while Christopher monitored a police scanner. "What do you mean, evolving?" Maria asked, already moving to examine his shoulder. "They're getting smarter, coordinating, using tactics." Kendall winced as she manipulated his injured joint. "And some of them, they're mutating, physically changing." "Like Bobby," Paula said quietly. "Before we left, I saw him. His skin was wrong." "The virus, or whatever this is, it's not just making them violent," Maria theorized, resetting Kendall's shoulder with practiced efficiency. "It's rewriting their biology, upgrading them." "Upgrading them into what?" Lorna demanded. Before anyone could respond, Christopher called out from his position. "Police scanners going crazy. Similar outbreaks all over the city. National Guard's been mobilized." "They'll lock down the neighborhood," Aaron predicted grimly. "Contain the spread." "They'll try," Kendall corrected, remembering the intelligence he'd seen in the infected's movements. "But I don't think—" A massive impact shook the clinic's front door, cutting him off. Through the reinforced windows, they could see dozens of infected gathering outside. They moved with military precision, taking up tactical positions around the building. At their center stood Bobby, his mutated form even more grotesque than before. Muscles rippled beneath translucent skin as he directed his troops with inhuman intelligence. "We need to move," Aaron decided, checking his ammunition. "This place won't hold them long." "The basement," Maria suggested. There's an old tunnel system under the clinic, left over from Prohibition, connects to the subway maintenance tunnels. Underground? Paula looked skeptical. With those things out there? Better than staying here to die, Christopher pointed out, helping Lorna gather supplies. Another impact rattled the doors. The infected had found a steel beam and were using it as a battering ram, coordinating their strikes with terrifying efficiency. The barricades wouldn't last much longer. Kendall? Corey looked to his leader for direction. Kendall studied the room, former rivals and strangers brought together by crisis. Beyond the walls, he could hear the infected communicating in their evolving language of clicks and whistles. Soon they'd breach the clinic, and then, we go down, he decided. But we need to split up. Single groups too easy to track. He turned to Aaron. Your crew takes the tunnel east, toward the river. We'll head west, try to reach the National Guard lines, draw them in different directions. Aaron nodded, years of street tactics recognizing the sound strategy. What about the civilians? I'll go with Aaron's group, Paula volunteered. I know the river district. I'm with Kendall, Maria stated firmly. You'll need a medic. They worked quickly, distributing supplies and weapons. The infected's battering ram had begun to splinter the reinforced door, sending wooden shards flying with each impact. Whatever they were becoming, they were getting stronger. Ready? Kendall asked as Maria opened the basement door. Below, concrete steps descended into darkness. Another impact shook the building. Through gaps in the barricades, they could see Bobby directing his troops with growing impatience. His mutations had continued. Bone spurs now protruded from his shoulders, and his jaw had distended to accommodate rows of razor-sharp teeth. Move, Aaron ordered, leading his group down the stairs. And Kendall, he turned back briefly. Watch your six. You too. The basement air was thick with decades of dust and decay. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow as they located the hidden tunnel entrance behind a false wall. Above, they could hear the infected finally breaching the clinic. They'll figure out where we went, Corey warned as they entered the tunnel. They're too smart now. I know. Kendall took point, leading them into the darkness. That's what I'm counting on. The tunnels stretched before them like an underground labyrinth, filled with shadows and echoes. Somewhere ahead lay either salvation or damnation. Behind them, inhuman sounds suggested the infected had found the basement entrance. The hunt was on. The maintenance tunnels beneath Detroit stretched endlessly into darkness, their concrete walls slick with decades of seepage. Kendall led his group forward, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom like searching fingers. Every few minutes, distant sounds echoed through the tunnel system, sometimes screams from above, sometimes the coordinated movements of the infected searching for them. They're in the tunnels, Corey whispered, his voice tight, getting closer. Maria checked her medical supplies as they moved, cataloging what she'd managed to grab from the clinic. The virus is mutating faster than anything I've ever seen. The way they're evolving, communicating. How long before they figure out to cut us off? Kendall asked, pausing at a junction. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the darkness, making it hard to pinpoint pursuit sounds. They already have, Christopher Ghost Rodriguez answered grimly. He'd chosen to stay with Kendall's group, his experience as a former tunnel rat proving invaluable. Listen. They fell silent. Through the complex network of tunnels, they could hear the infected's clicking communication coming from multiple directions. Not random sounds anymore, distinct patterns, like a crude language developing in real time. They're hurting us, Corey realized. Like wolves, Christopher agreed, driving us somewhere. A scream echoed through the tunnels, human, terrified, and close. Maria started to move toward it, but Kendall caught her arm. Could be Aaron's group, she argued. Or a trap, Kendall countered. They're learning to mimic. As if to prove his point, the scream came again, but this time it shifted midway into something inhuman. A hunting cry that was answered by others throughout the tunnel system. The infected were coordinating, using sound to track their prey's reactions. They moved deeper into the labyrinth, Christopher's knowledge helping them avoid dead ends and collapse zones. But the infected seemed to be everywhere now, their presence revealed by scratching sounds and glimpses of movement in connecting tunnels. Hold up, Christopher called softly, examining a junction ahead. Something's wrong. Kendall moved forward to look. The tunnel walls here showed fresh scratch marks, deep gouges in the concrete that no human hands could have made. Something had been changing down here, growing stronger. A whisper of movement was their only warning. A figure dropped from a maintenance shaft above. Bobby, but even more mutated than before. His massive frame had grown grotesquely, muscles rupturing through skin in places. Bone protrusions formed natural armor across his chest and shoulders. But worst was his face. His jaw had split vertically, forming quadruple mandibles filled with razor teeth. "Run!" Kendall shoved Maria aside as Bobby charged. The creature that had once been a bouncer moved with impossible speed, but its new mass worked against it in the narrow tunnel. Kendall rolled under a swinging arm, feeling the air displacement as claws missed him by inches. Corey opened fire, his shots echoing deafeningly in the confined space. The bullet struck Bobby's bone armor, ricocheting harmlessly. The creature turned with frightening intelligence, its split jaw spreading in what might have been a smile. "This way!" Christopher called from a side tunnel. "Maintenance room ahead." They sprinted through the darkness, Bobby's roars echoing behind them. Other infected answered his call, their cries coming from multiple directions. The hunt was reaching its climax. The maintenance room was a concrete box filled with decades-old equipment. Christopher slammed the heavy door shut behind them, spinning the locking wheel. "That won't hold him long," Kendall said, searching for another exit. There, a ladder led up to what looked like a service entrance. "Wait," Maria called, examining the old equipment. "Look at this." She pointed to scratch marks on the machinery, similar to those in the tunnel, but older. Many older, some partly hidden by rust. This has happened before, she realized. Maybe not exactly the same, but something like it. The city covered it up. A massive impact shook the door, followed by the sound of tearing metal. Bobby had found them. "Great history lesson," Corey said, helping Christopher stack equipment against the door. "But how does that help us now?" "Because," Maria explained quickly, "if this happened before, there might be contingencies in place. Emergency protocols." She pointed to faded warning signs on the wall. "This isn't just a maintenance room, it's part of the old flood control system." Kendall understood immediately. "We can flood the tunnels?" Another impact. The door began to buckle. "If the systems still work," Maria qualified, "but the infected are running hot. Their accelerated metabolism makes them vulnerable to temperature shock. Flood them with cold water." "Do it," Kendall ordered. "Corey, Christopher, buy us time." The door exploded inward, taking their barricade with it. Bobby's mutated form filled the entrance, his bone armor now covered in some kind of organic plating. Behind him, more infected gathered, their movements synchronized like parts of a single organism. Corey and Christopher opened fire, aiming for exposed flesh between armor plates. Bobby roared, a sound that shook dust from the ceiling, and charged forward. Maria worked frantically at the old control panel while Kendall provided covering fire. Nothing happened. "The system's dead," she cried. "No power." "Move!" Kendall spotted a fuse box on the wall. He emptied his magazine into it, sending sparks flying. The ancient equipment hummed to life. Bobby reached them just as Maria pulled the emergency release. Ancient pumps groaned to life somewhere in the darkness. The creature that had once been human hesitated, showing the first signs of uncertainty they'd seen. Water burst from multiple access points, filling the tunnel system with frigid liquid from the Detroit River. The infected's coordinated movements turned to panic as the cold water shocked their overheated systems. Bobby roared in pain as his mutations began to crack and split in the temperature change. "Up the ladder," Kendall ordered. "Now!" They climbed as the room filled with water and thrashing infected. Bobby made one final attempt to reach them, his clawed hand catching Kendall's leg. But the cold was affecting him too severely. His grip weakened, and Kendall kicked free. They emerged through a manhole into chaos. The streets above were a war zone. Military helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through smoke from burning buildings. In the distance, they could hear gunfire and explosions as the National Guard fought to contain the outbreak. "Look," Christopher pointed toward 8 Mile Road. A massive military convoy was approaching, led by armored vehicles. "They're setting up a quarantine zone." Aaron's group, Maria remembered. They were heading toward the river. Kendall checked his phone, but the military had knocked out cell service to prevent panic from spreading. There was no way to know if the others had survived. A new sound cut through the night, a high-pitched keening that made their teeth ache. From other manholes and tunnel entrances, infected began to emerge. The cold water had killed many, but those that survived seemed to be adapting, their mutations accelerating to compensate. They're evolving again, Maria observed clinically. Every challenge makes them stronger. Then we better end this fast. Kendall checked his remaining ammunition. The National Guard will have a command center. They need to know what we've learned about the previous outbreak, about how they're changing. You mean if we can reach it, Corey said, watching more infected emerge from the underground. When we reach it, Kendall corrected. He looked at his companions, a nurse, a gang lieutenant, a former tunnel rat, and his closest friend. An unlikely team, united by survival. We're the only ones who know what we're really dealing with, he continued. How they think, how they hunt. The military's fighting the infection they can see. We know what it's becoming. Above them, military helicopters began dropping flares, illuminating the streets in harsh white light. The infected moved through the artificial day like hunting packs, their mutations becoming more pronounced with each generation. Some now traveled on all fours, while others showed signs of even more extreme changes. They're not just getting stronger, Christopher observed. They're specializing, developing different types for different roles. Like a hive, Maria agreed, or an army. Kendall checked his weapons one final time. Then let's make sure they lose this war. They moved through the ruined streets of Detroit, heading toward the military perimeter. Behind them, Bobby's roar echoed from below ground, different now, carrying harmonics that made windows vibrate. More infected took up the call, their cries mixing into a terrifying chorus. The evolution of 8 Mile's nightmare was entering its next phase, but this time, humanity would be ready. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. The homeless man's scream echoed through Detroit's Cass corridor, like a bullet ricocheting off concrete walls. Marcus Reeves clutched his bleeding hand to his chest, watching dark blood seep through his fingers and drip onto the frost-covered ground. 20 years ago, he'd been Marcus Reeves, shift supervisor at the Chrysler plant, father of 2, husband to a beautiful wife named Eleanor. Now, at 58, he was just another shadow haunting the broken streets of Detroit's forgotten district. The bite shouldn't have hurt this much. Marcus leaned against the crumbling brick wall of the abandoned Alhambra apartments, his makeshift home for the past 3 winters. The November wind howled through the urban canyons, carrying the scent of burning trash and despair. Above him, clouds scudded across a steel-gray sky, threatening snow. The sun was setting early, as it always did this time of year, painting the graffiti-covered buildings in shades of bruised purple and angry red. The rat that had bitten him was unlike anything he'd seen in his years on the streets. Detroit had rats, every homeless person knew that. But this one had been different. Larger, more aggressive, with eyes that gleamed an unnatural shade of crimson in the failing light. When it launched itself at his hand, its bite felt calculated, purposeful. Now, as darkness crept across the corridor like spilled ink, Marcus felt the first waves of fever washing over him. The wound throbbed with an intensity that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, and strange patterns of light danced at the edges of his vision. He needed help. 3 blocks away, Sarah Chen was just finishing her shift at the free clinic. At 32, she'd spent the last 5 years serving the corridor's vulnerable population, earning the trust of people society had forgotten. Her father, a successful surgeon in Ann Arbor, called it a waste of her talent. Sarah called it her calling. She just finished updating Mrs. Rodriguez's medical records when Tommy, one of their regular patients, burst through the clinic's doors. Blood streamed from a gash in his forearm. "They're crazy," he gasped, collapsing into a chair. "Just started attacking people, like animals." Sarah grabbed her medical kit. "Who's attacking people, Tommy?" "Marcus and others. Something's wrong with them. Their eyes." Tommy shuddered. "Started with Marcus. He bit someone, and then they both just changed." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew Marcus, had treated him for years. He was one of the gentlest souls she'd ever met, despite his rough appearance. The idea of him attacking anyone seemed absurd. Before she could question Tommy further, screams erupted from the street outside. Sarah rushed to the window. In the gathering darkness, she could make out several figures moving with jerky, unnatural motions. A woman ran past the clinic, pursued by what looked like Mr. Henderson from the convenience store. But something was wrong with Henderson's gait. He moved like a puppet with half its strings cut. "Lock the doors," Sarah ordered the clinic's security guard, James Wilson. "Now!" But James was already moving, his face grim. 20 years as a Detroit cop before retiring to clinic security had taught him to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. The clinic's ancient fluorescent lights flickered as Sarah treated Tommy's wound. The cut was deep, but clean. Not a bite. Still, his story about Marcus troubled her. She'd just seen Marcus yesterday, giving him his regular blood pressure medication. He'd been fine then, telling her about his granddaughter's latest letter. A crash from the front of the clinic made them both jump. Through the reception area's windows, Sarah could see shapes moving in the darkness. Multiple shapes, pressing against the glass with increasing force. "We need to move," James announced, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Back door, through the lab, now." They had just reached the corridor leading to the lab when the front windows imploded. The sounds that followed would haunt Sarah's nightmares for years to come. The wet slap of bodies climbing through broken glass, inhuman growls, and beneath it all, a high-pitched keening that made her skin crawl. James pushed them toward the lab. "Go! I'll hold them." The security guard never finished his sentence. A figure launched itself from the shadows. Marcus Reeves, but not the Marcus she knew. His skin was corpse pale, dark veins standing out like roads on a map. His eyes... Sarah's medical mind registered the symptoms even as she recoiled. Extreme mydriasis, hemorrhaging in the sclera, signs of severe infection. But it was the intelligence behind those eyes that terrified her. Feral, hungry, yet somehow calculating. James managed to get off 2 shots before Marcus reached him. The bullet struck center mass, but Marcus didn't even slow down. His teeth sank into James's throat in a spray of arterial blood. "Run!" James screamed, his last act of service to protect those in his care. Sarah grabbed Tommy's arm and ran. The clinic's lab was Dr. Marcus Wong's sanctuary. Even now, working late as usual, he was focused on his microscope, unaware of the chaos unfolding above. The Harvard-educated virologist had chosen to work in the corridor despite countless offers from prestigious research hospitals. Like Sarah, he believed in serving those most in need. The specimen under his microscope was from a routine blood test, but something about it bothered him. The patient had complained of fever and aggressive impulses shortly after being bitten by a rat. Normally, Wong would have prescribed antibiotics and a tetanus shot, but these blood cells, they were behaving strangely. As he adjusted the magnification, the lab's lights flickered. Wong looked up, annoyed. That's when he heard the screams. Footsteps thundered down the stairs to the lab. Wong reached for the phone on his desk, but the line was dead. The door burst open, revealing Sarah Chen and Tommy, both out of breath and spattered with blood. "Dr. Wong," Sarah gasped. "We need to seal the lab. Now." Wong didn't argue. Years of working with dangerous pathogens had taught him to act first and ask questions later when it came to potential contamination. He quickly entered the code that would seal the lab's security doors, a system installed due to their work with controlled substances. The heavy doors slid shut just as the first infected reached them. Through the reinforced windows, Wong watched in horror as more gathered. Their movements were wrong, their faces twisted in feral snarls. Among them, he recognized several clinic patients. "What happened up there?" he demanded. Sarah quickly explained while helping Tommy into a chair. Wong's face grew increasingly grave as she described Marcus's transformation and James's last stand. "Show me the bite marks on the infected," he said. "What? The ones who've turned, they were all bitten, yes?" Sarah thought back. "Yes, Marcus bit James, and Tommy said Marcus was bitten by a rat," Wong finished. He turned to his microscope. "Look at this." Sarah peered through the lens at the blood sample. Even with her medical training, it took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The blood cells were mutating, their structure changing in real time. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That sample is from yesterday. Another rat bite victim. I've never seen a pathogen behave like this. The rate of mutation, the way it affects cellular structure." Wong's voice trailed off as he studied the infected pressing against the lab windows. "This isn't natural." A new sound cut through the chaos, breaking glass from the floor above, followed by inhuman shrieks. The infected were finding other ways into the building. "We need to document this," Wong said, already moving to gather samples and notes. "If this is what I think it is, Sarah, humanity needs to know what we're dealing with." Outside the lab, Detroit was transforming. The infection spread through the corridor like wildfire, following the paths of human connection. A bite victim would turn within an hour, attacking friends and family without recognition. Those who survived the initial attacks turned just as quickly, creating a cascade of violence that overwhelmed local emergency services. Detective James Rodriguez was working late at his desk in the central precinct when the first calls came in. 20 years on the force hadn't prepared him for what he was hearing. Multiple reports of violent attacks, suspects seemingly immune to pain or verbal commands, victims displaying extreme behavioral changes within minutes of being bitten. "Rodriguez!" Lieutenant Sarah Harper's voice cut through the chaos of the dispatch center. "We need you in the corridor. Something's gone sideways at the free clinic." James grabbed his coat, checking his service weapon and spare magazines. His partner, Diana Wells, fell into step beside him as they headed for the parking garage. "What are we looking at?" Diana asked. "Mass casualty event, possible riot situation," James replied, but something in his gut told him this was different. He'd grown up in the corridor, still lived there in the Strathmore apartments. He knew its rhythms, its patterns of violence. This felt wrong. As they pulled out of the garage, James's radio crackled with an update. "All units be advised, CDC representatives are en route. Possible biological hazard. Do not approach infected individuals without proper protection." Diana looked at him. "Biological hazard? What the hell is going on?" The scene that greeted them at the edge of the corridor answered her question in the worst possible way. The streets were chaos incarnate. People ran in every direction, pursued by figures that moved with jerky, aggressive determination. As James watched, one of the pursuers caught a fleeing woman. The attack that followed was brutal, animalistic. "Jesus Christ," Diana breathed, drawing her weapon. A figure slammed into their cruiser's hood, a teenage boy, but his face was wrong. Dark veins pulsed beneath pale skin, and his eyes. James felt his world tilt as he recognized the kid who delivered his newspapers. "Mike?" he called out, but there was no recognition in those feral eyes. The boy launched himself at the windshield with inhuman strength, spider-webbing the glass. Diana threw the car into reverse as more infected emerged from the shadows, attracted by the noise. "Central, be advised," James radioed, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. "We need full tactical response. Multiple hostile individuals showing signs of infection. Request immediate evacuation of civilians from the corridor." But as they retreated to establish a perimeter, James knew it was already too late. The corridor's narrow streets and dense population had become a perfect breeding ground for whatever this was. And somewhere in that maze of darkness and violence was his apartment building, where his elderly neighbors trusted their security to locked doors and his protection. He had to go back. In the sealed laboratory beneath the free clinic, Dr. Wong worked frantically to document his findings. The virus defied everything he knew about pathogen behavior. Under his microscope, infected blood cells didn't just mutate, they seemed to communicate with each other, coordinating their changes in ways that should have been impossible. "Sarah, look at this," he called out, adjusting the microscope's focus. "The virus isn't just affecting individual cells. It's creating a network." Sarah left her makeshift barricade by the door to peer through the lens. Tommy had fallen asleep in the corner, his wound properly bandaged but his fever rising. They both knew what that meant. The virus could spread through more than just bites. "It's like they're forming a hive mind," Sarah whispered, watching the cells pulse in synchronized patterns. A crash from above made them both jump. The infected were systematically searching the building, their movements becoming more coordinated with each passing hour. Wong quickly transferred his findings to an encrypted hard drive, along with his suspicions about the virus's origins. "This isn't random mutation," he explained, fingers flying over his keyboard. "The virus's structure shows signs of engineering. Someone designed this, Sarah. They weaponized it." "But why?" Sarah asked, helping him gather crucial samples. "Why start it in the corridor? Think about it. Dense population, limited resources, high poverty rate, perfect testing ground. And rats." Wong's voice trailed off as scratching sounds emerged from the ventilation system. "They're the perfect vector. Every city has a rat problem, especially in poor areas." The scratching grew louder. Outside, Detective James Rodriguez and his partner Diana Wells had reached the Strathmore apartments. The street was a war zone. Burning cars provided irregular islands of light in the gathering darkness. The infected moved through the shadows in packs now, herding survivors into blind alleys. "James, we need to call for backup," Diana insisted, checking her ammunition. 3 magazines left, plus what was in her weapon. "No time," James replied. He just spotted Mrs. Peterson through her 3rd-floor window, frantically waving for help. "Building's still secure, but they're gathering. We go now or we don't go at all." They made it to the front door just as the first pack of infected charged. Diana dropped 2 with headshots, but the others didn't even slow. James unlocked the security door with shaking hands, pulling Diana inside as snapping teeth closed inches from her shoulder. The lobby was dark, emergency lights casting everything in a bloody red glow. James led the way up the stairs, his weapon ready. They found Mrs. Peterson on the 3rd floor, barricaded in her apartment with her husband Robert and 3 other residents. "Thank God," Mrs. Peterson sobbed. "Robert's sick. He was bitten, trying to help the Martinez boy from 4B. James looked at Robert Peterson, retired high school principal, deacon at First Baptist, married 40 years. Sweat beaded on the older man's forehead, and dark veins were beginning to show under his skin. "How long ago?" Diana asked softly. 20 minutes, Robert answered, his voice steady despite the tremors racking his body. "I can feel it, changing me. You need to get them out of here now." "Robert, no," Mrs. Peterson pleaded. "We can get help." "Martha," Robert's voice cracked. "My love, you know there's no help coming, not in time." He turned to James. "You have your cuffs, detective?" James nodded, understanding. With tears in her eyes, Mrs. Peterson watched as they handcuffed her husband to the radiator. Robert kissed her hand one last time. "Go," he whispered. "Remember me as I was." They had just reached the stairwell when Robert's screams began. Across the city, the military response was finally mobilizing. Colonel Sarah Brandt stood in the mobile command center, watching drone footage of the spreading infection. 20 years of combat experience, including 2 tours in Iraq, hadn't prepared her for this. "Quarantine line is holding at Warren Avenue," her XO reported, "but we're getting reports of infected outside the containment zone." "How?" Brandt demanded. "We locked this down." "Sewers," another officer interrupted, pulling up infrared imaging. "They're using the underground tunnels. And the rats, ma'am, the rats are spreading faster than we can track." Brandt studied the tactical display. The corridor was lost, that was obvious. But they might still be able to contain this if they acted fast enough, decisively enough. The orders she was about to give would end her career if she was wrong. "Call in the airstrike," she commanded. "We burn it out, now." Back in the clinic's laboratory, Dr. Wong and Sarah had discovered something horrifying. The virus wasn't just coordinating infected individuals, it was evolving them. Blood samples from recently turned victims showed dramatic cellular changes, enhanced muscle density, accelerated healing, and most terrifying of all, signs of neural network development. "They're not just getting stronger," Wong explained, securing another sample. "They're getting smarter, learning." A ventilation grate crashed to the floor, followed by a wave of rats, dozens of them, their eyes glowing red in the laboratory's emergency lighting. Wong shoved the hard drive into Sarah's hands. "Run! Get this to the CDC! It's our only chance!" The rats swarmed him before she could react. Sarah grabbed Tommy, pulling him toward the emergency exit as Wong's screams filled the lab. The door sealed behind them automatically, containing the rats but trapping Wong inside. Above ground, James Rodriguez's group had grown. They'd gathered more survivors as they moved through the Strathmore, including a pregnant woman named Maria Santos and her 5-year-old son, Luis. Diana took point as they made their way down to the basement, where the building's old maintenance tunnels could provide an escape route. "Where are we going?" Maria asked, cradling her belly protectively. "Military's set up safe zones," James explained, helping Mrs. Peterson down the stairs. "Nearest one's at Wayne State, 2 miles north." 2 miles? Mrs. Peterson's voice shook. "Through that?" A massive explosion rocked the building before James could answer. Through the basement's narrow windows, they saw flashes of light in the sky, jets making their first bombing run on the corridor. "They're burning it," Diana whispered. "My God, they're actually burning it." The building shook again as more explosions walked their way across the district. James pushed open the access door to the maintenance tunnels, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "No choice now," he said. "We go down." The tunnels were a maze of concrete and rusted pipes, decades of Detroit's hidden infrastructure rotting beneath their feet. Water dripped steadily from somewhere ahead, and their flashlight beams caught occasional movements in the shadows. Rats fleeing the chaos above. Luis suddenly screamed. One of the rats had launched itself at the boy's face, moving with unnatural speed. James caught it in mid-leap, crushing it against the wall, but not before its teeth grazed his arm. "James," Diana's voice was heavy with concern. "Keep moving," he ordered, wrapping his arm with a handkerchief. "I'll take rear guard." They all knew what that meant. Sarah Chen emerged from the clinic's emergency exit into a scene from the apocalypse. The military's bombing campaign had set much of the corridor ablaze, creating a hellish landscape of burning buildings and smoke-filled streets. Through the chaos, infected individuals moved with increasing purpose, coordinating their movements like a well-trained hunting pack. She clutched Dr. Wong's hard drive to her chest, supporting Tommy with her other arm. The CDC's forward operating base was somewhere north of here, past Wayne State. But the direct route was blocked by fires and infected. A familiar voice called out from a nearby alley, "Sarah, over here!" Detective Diana Wells waved them over. She stood guard as a group of survivors emerged from a maintenance tunnel. James Rodriguez, an elderly woman, a pregnant woman with a small boy, and others Sarah didn't recognize. "James is infected," Diana said quietly as Sarah approached. "Rat bite. He's giving us as much time as he can." Sarah looked at her own patient. Tommy's fever was spiking, the virus working its way through his system. Soon he'd turn to. "I have something," she said, holding up the hard drive. "Dr. Wong, he found something about the virus. We need to get this to the CDC." High above, military jets screamed through the smoke-filled sky, unleashing another wave of destruction. The infected were learning to avoid the bombs now, taking cover in buildings and tunnels. Each failed attack made them stronger, smarter. The war for Detroit's soul was entering its next phase. But for the survivors trapped in the burning corridor, the only question that mattered was, could they make it through the next hour alive? The group moved through the burning corridor like ghosts, staying low to avoid both the thick smoke and the increasingly organized packs of infected. James Rodriguez took point despite his deteriorating condition, his decades of police experience guiding them through the urban battlefield. Every few minutes, he checked the bite on his arm. The dark veins had spread halfway to his shoulder now. 3 more blocks to the CDC perimeter, he growled, his voice growing rougher with each passing minute. "Follow Warren Avenue. Stay in the shadows." Sarah watched him with professional concern. As a medical practitioner, she'd seen dozens of infections progress now, and she recognized the signs. James had an hour left at most before the change took him. Behind her, Tommy wasn't doing much better. Diana dropped back to walk beside Sarah. "The boy won't make it, will he?" Sarah shook her head. "The virus moves faster in younger people. Their stronger immune systems actually speed up the transformation." She patted the hard drive in her pocket. "But if we can get Dr. Wong's research to the CDC..." An explosion cut her off as another airstrike hit nearby. The military was getting desperate, hitting targets with increasing frequency. But the infected were adapting, learning to anticipate the attack patterns. Some had even started using tools, crude weapons, improvised shields. The virus wasn't just changing their bodies, it was evolving their intelligence. "Movement ahead," James warned, raising his fist in a police hand signal. Lot of them, organized. Through the smoke, they could see a large group of infected blocking Warren Avenue. They moved with military precision, establishing defensive positions and coordinating their movements with hand gestures. At their center stood a figure Sarah recognized, Marcus Reeves, Patient Zero. But he wasn't the confused homeless man anymore. His eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence as he directed his makeshift army. "They're evolving," Sarah whispered, "developing a hierarchy. Marcus was first, he's becoming their leader." "Back," James ordered. "We'll cut through the old theater." He never finished the sentence. A wave of rats poured from a nearby storm drain, hundreds of them, their eyes glowing red in the firelight. The infected turned at the sound, Marcus's head snapping toward their position with terrifying speed. "Run!" Diana screamed, opening fire on the rat swarm. The shots echoed through the street, drawing more infected. The group scattered. Maria Santos and her son Luis followed Diana toward the theater. Mrs. Peterson and 2 others fled down an alley. Sarah found herself running alongside James, half carrying Tommy as they ducked into the ruins of an old department store. "Get him upstairs," James ordered, covering their retreat. "I'll hold them here." "James, I'm done, Sarah. We both know it, but I can give you time." He checked his remaining ammunition. "Get that research to the CDC. Make this mean something." The last Sarah saw of Detective Rodriguez, he was setting up a defensive position behind an old checkout counter, his movements already showing the jerky precision of the turning. Tommy collapsed halfway up the stairs, his transformation accelerating. "Go," he gasped. I'll help James." Sarah ran. The department store's upper floor offered a grim view of the corridor's destruction. Fires raged unchecked through entire blocks. Military helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the smoke. In the streets below, infected moved with increasing coordination, establishing territories and hunting patterns. Sarah spotted the CDC perimeter, a heavily fortified position around Wayne State's medical campus. But reaching it meant crossing 6 blocks of infected-controlled territory. She checked her phone. No signal. The military was jamming communications to prevent panic from spreading to the wider city. A familiar voice called out behind her, "Dr. Chen." Diana emerged from the shadows, supporting Maria Santos. Luis clung to his mother's leg, terrified but quiet. "Mrs. Peterson?" Sarah asked. Diana shook her head. She went back for her husband. Wouldn't leave him. More explosions rocked the building. The military was concentrating their fire on the larger infected gatherings now, trying to disrupt their growing organization. But for every group they destroyed, 2 more emerged, learning from their predecessors' mistakes. "We need a distraction," Diana said, studying the street below. Something to draw them away from. The building trembled as a massive shape crashed through the floor behind them. Marcus Reeves stood in the rubble, but he'd changed. His body had mutated further, muscles bulging grotesquely beneath pale skin. Behind him, other infected poured through the hole, moving with coordinated precision. "Give me the drive," Marcus spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. "The research. Now." Sarah stumbled back. "You can talk? We evolve, adapt, become more." Marcus's lips pulled back in a horrific smile. "This is the next step. Humanity's replacement." Diana opened fire, emptying her magazine into Marcus's chest. The bullet struck home but seemed to cause only minor inconvenience. His wounds sealed almost instantly. "The virus isn't just changing us," Marcus continued, advancing slowly. "It's upgrading us, making us better, stronger, smarter." He gestured to his followers. "We are the future." A massive explosion lit up the night sky. One of the military's bombs had struck a gas main, creating a chain reaction that set off multiple secondary explosions. The floor beneath them began to crack. "The drive," Sarah whispered to Diana. "Get it to the CDC. I'll hold them here." "Sarah, no. Take them." Sarah shoved the drive into Diana's hands, then pushed Maria and Luis toward the fire escape. "Go." As Diana led the others away, Sarah faced Marcus. "You want to know what the research says? The virus is killing you. Every evolution, every mutation brings you closer to total cellular breakdown. You're not the future. You're a dead end." Marcus roared, a sound of pure rage that shattered windows. He charged forward just as the floor gave way. Sarah dove aside as Marcus and his followers plunged through the collapsing structure. She rolled to her feet and ran. The next hour was a blur of fire and violence. Sarah made her way through the burning corridor, drawing as many infected as she could away from Diana's group. She caught glimpses of them sometimes, moving from shadow to shadow, getting closer to the CDC perimeter. Finally, exhausted and smoke-stained, Sarah found herself cornered in the ruins of the free clinic. She'd come full circle. Through the broken windows, she could see Diana's group reaching the military checkpoint. They'd made it. Marcus found her there, his mutated form filling the doorway. More infected gathered behind him, their movements becoming increasingly erratic. Sarah smiled grimly. The cellular breakdown was beginning. "It's over, Marcus. The research will help them develop a cure. Your evolution ends here." Marcus charged forward just as the clinic's support beams gave way. The building collapsed, burying them both in tons of burning debris. 3 months later, Diana stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional committee. Dr. Wong's research was instrumental in developing the vaccine, she explained. The virus was engineered to create a coordinated superorganism using urban rat populations as vectors. But the same mechanism that allowed the infected to evolve so quickly also caused their eventual breakdown. And the origin? A senator asked. Do we know who created it? Diana hesitated. Evidence suggests it was a rogue biotech firm, but their records were destroyed in the containment operation. What matters is that we're better prepared now. The vaccine has been distributed to major urban centers worldwide, and new protocols are in place for early detection. She didn't mention the rumors, stories of infected rats appearing in other cities, of strange behaviors and missing persons. The Cass Corridor outbreak had been contained, but Diana knew better than anyone. Evolution never truly stops. In Detroit, the corridor was being rebuilt. The official story blamed a gas main explosion and subsequent fire for the destruction. Few knew the full truth, and fewer spoke of it. But sometimes in the deepest parts of the night, residents swear they can hear sounds in the old tunnel systems. Scratching, scurrying, organizing, waiting, evolving. And in the shadows, red eyes watch and plan and remember. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. What's your favorite slot machine? I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Her name was Linda, a middle-aged woman with a penchant for pearls and a perpetual smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had been a regular at the casino for as long as I had been working here. She would always sit at the same machine, playing the same game, smoking the same brand of cigarettes, and leaving with the same amount of money she came with. It was a strange form of consistency that had become a comforting background noise to my otherwise monotonous shifts as a security guard. But now the clanking of slot machines and the murmur of the crowds had been replaced by a heavy silence. The only sounds were the occasional groan and the distant thud of a body slumping against the floor. I had been stuck in the security room for 3 days, watching the infection spread like wildfire across the gaming floor. The once bustling casino now resembled a macabre playground, with chairs overturned and slot machines flashing in a deserted dance of despair. The air conditioning had given out on the first day, and the heat had been building steadily since. The smell of sweat and fear lingered, even though the living had mostly cleared out. I had a stash of water bottles and a couple of protein bars to keep me going, but the isolation was starting to get to me. My eyes burned from staring at the flickering screens, and my mind played tricks with the shadows, turning them into the monsters that now roamed outside my door. The last time I checked, the infected had breached the main entrance, their teeth bared in a silent snarl. The sight had sent a chill down my spine. These weren't the glamorous undead of Hollywood. They were my colleagues, my patrons, my friends, reduced to ravenous creatures that craved the taste of flesh. I had seen enough to know that a single bite meant the end of everything that made us human. Now the decision to leave was no longer a matter of if, but when. I checked my makeshift barricade for the 100th time, a flimsy collection of office chairs and a desk. It wasn't going to hold for long. Outside, the once vibrant neon lights had dimmed to an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the floor. The city of Detroit had gone quiet, swallowed by the darkness that had consumed it. My hand hovered over the walkie-talkie, the weight of its silence a stark reminder of the world that had moved on without me. I knew that when I stepped out of this room, I would be stepping into the jaws of the beast. Yet, I also knew that if I didn't move soon, I would become just another victim of this hellish nightmare. The security camera flickered, and for a brief moment I saw Linda's machine. It was still flashing, as if waiting for her to return. I took a deep breath and whispered a silent goodbye to the ghost of normalcy that lingered in the air. It was time to face the music and the monsters. I checked my handgun, the cold metal a comforting weight in my grip. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye on the surveillance feed. It was a figure in the kitchen, a place I had assumed was as abandoned as the rest of the casino. The figure was human, alive and uninfected. My heart pounded in my chest. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, her hair matted with sweat and her eyes wide with fear. She was moving with purpose, trying to stay low and avoid detection. Without wasting a second, I grabbed the intercom receiver and spoke into it, my voice echoing through the desolate halls. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm in the security office." Her head snapped up and she froze for a moment before darting a look around. She was definitely listening. I could see the hope flicker in her eyes. "I've been watching the cameras," I continued. "I can help you. Stay where you are." My eyes darted to the monitors, searching for the nearest group of the infected. The heat had driven them into a frenzy, and their movements were erratic and unpredictable. I needed a plan, and fast. The kitchen was a maze of cold metal and steamy heat, not an ideal place to hide. But if she could just hold on a little longer, I might be able to get her to safety. "Listen carefully," I began, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "I'm going to start the emergency sirens and then turn on all the slot machines. That should draw the infected away from your location. Once the coast is clear, I'll guide you to me." I watched as she nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. My thumb hovered over the siren button, and with a deep breath, I pushed it down. The wail pierced the silence like a banshee's scream, sending a shiver down my spine. On the screen, the infected snapped to attention, their heads swiveling in the direction of the sound. As the chaos grew, I saw the woman's chance. "Now!" I shouted into the intercom. "Move, stick to the right wall, and stay low." Her eyes locked onto the screen, showing the route to the security office. She took a deep breath and disappeared from the camera's view. The sirens wailed on, and I hoped to whatever God was left in this city that it was enough. With a flick of a switch, I turned on every slot machine, filling the air with the cacophony of artificial jingles and flashing lights. The infected were drawn in like moths to a flame, leaving a clear path for her. My heart was racing now, and beads of sweat trickled down my forehead. I whispered words of encouragement to myself, willing her to be safe. The minutes stretched into an eternity as I watched the screens, waiting for any sign of her. Then I saw her. She was moving fast, weaving through the aisles of slot machines like a ghost. The infected were still distracted by the lights and sounds, but it wouldn't be for long. "You're almost there," I murmured, my voice strained with tension. The corridor grew closer, and the door to the security office was in sight. I leaned in, willing her to move faster. Just a few more steps and she would be safe. But just as she was about to make it, a figure stumbled into view. It was a man, his eyes glazed and his mouth open in a silent scream. I swore under my breath and reached for the intercom. "Look out!" I shouted, but it was too late. The infected had spotted her. The man lunged, and she stumbled, dropping to the ground. In an instant, she was on her back, kicking and screaming. The infected man's teeth snapped at the air just millimeters from her neck. I couldn't just watch. I had to help her. With a roar of desperation, I threw open the door to the security office. The stale air of the casino rushed in, and the sirens seemed to grow louder. My handgun was at the ready as I sprinted towards the struggle. As I approached, I could see the terror etched on her face. But she wasn't just lying there, waiting to die. She was fighting with everything she had, her eyes full of the kind of fire that I hadn't seen in a long time. The infected man was relentless, his teeth snapping and drool flying as he tried to get a piece of her. I raised my gun, aiming for his head, but the confined space and the chaos of the fight made it difficult. He was too close to her, and I didn't want to risk hitting her. "Keep fighting," I yelled, trying to be heard over the sirens. "I'm right here!" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, she stopped struggling, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. That was all the opening I needed. I squeezed the trigger, and the infected man's head jerked back with a sickening crack. He collapsed to the ground, his body going limp. The woman scrambled away from him, her chest heaving with panic. "Thank you," she gasped, her voice trembling. "What's your name?" "Jim," I said, reaching out a hand to help her up. "Security guard, what's yours?" "Karen," she managed, taking my hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes still wide with fear. "Thank you, Jim." The sirens were deafening now, and the flashing lights cast a strobe effect over the casino floor. The infected had gathered around the slot machines, drawn to the chaos like moths to a flame. We had to move fast. "The sprinkler system," I yelled over the din. "It's our only shot at a distraction, but the water pressure is low and won't hold for long. We've got one chance to use it." Karen nodded, her eyes focused. She was sharp, I could see it. "What's the plan?" "We'll head for the parking garage. There's a casino van parked. It should have enough gas to get us out of here, but we've got to be quick and stay together." I triggered the sprinkler system, and the sudden burst of water rained down from the ceiling. The infected's attention was drawn upwards as they howled and danced in the spray, their movements becoming more erratic. Karen and I took advantage of the distraction, slipping through the casino floor like shadows. The sound of the sprinklers muffled our footsteps as we weaved between the slot machines and gambling tables. The garage door was in sight, a beacon of hope in the strobe-lit chaos. We moved quickly but cautiously, adrenaline pulsing through our veins. The water from the sprinklers created a misty veil around us, obscuring our vision and making the air thick with the smell of chlorine and panic. But as we approached the exit, our hearts sank. Several infected had gathered in front of the door, drawn by the sound of our footsteps on the wet floor. They stood between us and freedom, a snarling barricade of teeth and claws. I pushed Karen behind me, raising my gun with a trembling hand. "We can't fight them all," she whispered. Thinking fast, I set an alarm on my phone for 1 minute and chucked it into the fray of slot machines. The infected swarmed towards the sound like sharks to chum. "Run," I shouted, and together we sprinted for the door. The alarm blared, and the infected surged towards it, giving us the opening we needed. We dashed through the doorway, and I slammed it shut behind us just as the first of them reached us. The wood groaned under their weight, and I knew we had to move fast before they broke through. The parking garage was a maze of cars and concrete pillars, the dim emergency lights flickering like the last gasps of a dying world. The sound of the alarm grew faint behind us, swallowed by the echoes of our own desperate breathing. The air was cooler here, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the casino. I spotted the van, a dull gray beacon in the sea of darkness. It was parked in the far corner, and we had to navigate the tight aisles, dodging the occasional infected that had stumbled into the garage. The van's keys were on a pegboard by the elevator, still attached to a plastic fob with the casino's logo. As we approached the van, I could feel the tension coiling tighter in my chest. The alarm had bought us some time, but not much. The door was unlocked, and we clambered inside, slamming it shut behind us. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of the parking space, tires screeching on the wet concrete. The garage's exit was a metal grate, and I knew we had to time it perfectly. If the infected heard us, we were as good as dead. We drove in silence, the only sound the thumping of our racing hearts and the hum of the engine. As we approached the exit, I saw a horde of them gathered outside, their eyes reflecting the red glow of the emergency lights. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I took a deep breath. "Hold on," I told Karen, and floored it. The van smashed through the grate with a deafening clang, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. The infected surged towards us, but we were already accelerating down the ramp and onto the deserted streets of Detroit. The city lay before us, a ghostly tableau of abandoned cars and shattered glass. Our escape was not without casualties. Several of the creatures latched onto the van, their nails scraping against the metal as we sped away. I could feel the van's weight shift as they clung to it, their moans a chilling reminder of what we'd left behind. But we didn't look back. We had survived the casino, and now we had a chance to survive the city. The van's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a path to safety, or at least to the unknown. As we drove, the sirens grew fainter, replaced by the steady thrum of the engine. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and fear. We had made it this far, but we both knew the real battle was just beginning. We exchanged a look, our eyes meeting in the rearview mirror. It was a look of grim determination, a silent promise to stick together. We were two strangers in a city of monsters, but for now, we had each other. And in a world gone mad, that was all that mattered. The van jolted as we hit a pothole, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but we had a plan. We'd find a safe place, regroup, and maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way to fight back against the infection that had claimed our home. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. In the grimy shadows of a deserted Detroit alleyway, Larry leaned against a brick wall, his eyes scanning the empty street. He adjusted the wool cap over his greasy hair, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His skin was a patchwork of scars and tattoos, each telling a story he'd rather keep to himself. Across from him, Mike shivered, his hands buried in the pockets of a worn leather jacket. They were two guys down on their luck, looking for a break in the form of a car to call their own. The rumble of a distant engine grew louder, and Larry's heart quickened. "Here we go," he murmured, flicking his cigarette away. A sleek sedan approached, its headlights cutting through the night. It slowed to a crawl, and Mike stepped out from the shadows, his eyes fixed on the driver's side window. The car rolled to a stop, and for a moment, everything was silent but for the pounding bass of a hip-hop track thumping from somewhere nearby. The driver, a middle-aged woman with a worried look, rolled down the window a crack. "You guys need help?" she asked, her voice strained. Larry flashed a winning smile, hiding the crowbar tucked behind his back. "Yeah, ma'am," he said. "Just ran out of gas. Can you spare a lift?" Her eyes searched their faces, and for a split second, Mike thought she'd recognize the desperation in his eyes. But she nodded, unlocking the doors. They climbed in, Larry in the front and Mike in the back, the leather seats sticking to their sweaty skin. The car's interior smelled faintly of perfume and fast food. The woman's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she pulled away from the curb. They drove in tense silence, the city's abandoned buildings flashing by like the frames of an old horror flick. Mike's thoughts raced as he studied the woman. Something wasn't right about her, a sense of unease he couldn't quite pinpoint. It was the way she kept glancing in the rear view, her eyes darting between them and the road, and the way she chewed her lower lip like she was holding back something she wanted to scream. "You okay, ma'am?" Larry asked, trying to ease the tension with forced charm. She nodded tightly, not taking her eyes off the road. The car's GPS squawked, guiding them through the desolate streets. The closer they got to the highway, the more Larry's gut churned with excitement. The city limits meant safety, a place to ditch the car and make a clean break. Suddenly, the woman slammed on the brakes, throwing them both forward. "What the?" Mike started, but was cut off by her frantic voice. "Look," she pointed out the windshield to a group of figures staggering towards the car, arms outstretched. In the dim streetlight, Larry could see their faces were twisted into snarls, eyes glazed over with a terrifying hunger. His heart skipped a beat. "The hell's wrong with those people?" "It's the infection," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It started a few days ago, spreading like wildfire. They bite, you turn." Her words sent a cold shiver down Larry's spine. He'd heard the rumors, but seeing it was another thing entirely. The figures grew closer, their guttural moans filling the air. Mike fumbled for the door handle, ready to bolt. "We gotta go," he yelled, but the woman was already shifting into reverse, the tires screeching as she spun the sedan around. The creatures stumbled after them, their movements jerky and unnatural. As they sped away, Larry caught a glimpse of one lunging at the car, teeth bared. The woman's eyes were glued to the rear view, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The car's tires squealed as she took a sharp turn, and Mike felt his stomach lurch. They were driving deeper into the city, not out. "Why'd you turn around?" he shouted over the din of the engine. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I have to get home, to my kids." Larry's mind raced. They had to get out of here before the infected surrounded them. He reached for the door handle, ready to make a break for it if necessary, but the woman had a plan of her own. She floored the gas pedal, the sedan rocketing down the alleyway, leaving the creatures in their dust. The GPS led them to a narrow side street, and she turned sharply, the car's tires skidding on the pavement. Larry's head smacked against the dashboard, stars exploding in his vision. When he looked up, they were in a quiet neighborhood, the houses dark and seemingly abandoned. The woman's breathing was ragged. "My house is just up here," she said, pointing to a two-story with a flickering porch light. "You can barricade yourselves in. It's as safe as anywhere." They jumped out of the car, the cold air biting at their skin. Larry could see the fear in Mike's eyes, mirroring his own. As they approached the house, the woman fumbled with her keys, the jingling sound eerily loud in the stillness. The door swung open, revealing a hallway lined with family photos and a staircase leading to darkness. As they stepped inside, Larry heard a guttural growl from upstairs. The woman's face paled. "They're already here," she murmured. "My babies." The sound of shuffling footsteps grew closer. It was time to run, but where? The infection had turned the city into a deadly maze, and every corner could hide a new horror. They dashed through the house, Larry's boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The woman's eyes were wet with tears, guiding them to the basement door. She shoved it open, revealing a steep set of stairs leading down into darkness. "Take this," she said, shoving a set of keys into Larry's hand. "There's a car in the garage. It's your best shot." Mike hesitated, but Larry grabbed his arm. "Let's go." They sprinted down the stairs, the door slamming shut above them. The basement was cold and musty, filled with the detritus of a life interrupted. Half-empty beer bottles, a dusty treadmill, a forgotten Christmas tree leaning in the corner. The growling grew louder. They had to move fast. The garage door was padlocked, but Larry fumbled with the keys until he found the right one. The lock clicked open, and they burst into the small space, illuminated by the flickering bulb above. An old station wagon sat parked, looking like it hadn't been driven in years. It was their only hope. They scrambled inside, Larry in the driver's seat, Mike in the passenger's. Larry's hands trembled as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, sounding like a cough from the depths of the car's mechanical throat. The door upstairs crashed open, and the infected stumbled into the house, their cries of hunger piercing the night. They had seconds. Larry threw the car into reverse, the tires squealing as they shot out of the garage. He slammed the gear into drive and peeled out of the driveway. The woman was nowhere to be seen, lost to the chaos they'd left behind. The infected stumbled into the street, but Larry didn't slow down. He had to get them out of here. The sedan's taillights grew smaller in the rearview mirror as they sped away from the house and into the unknown. The city was a minefield now, every shadow potentially hiding a new threat. Mike scanned the streets, his eyes darting between the sidewalks and the horizon. "We need to get to the highway," he said through clenched teeth. "If we can get out of the city, we've got a chance." Larry nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They sped through red lights and abandoned intersections, the station wagon's engine roaring like a beast escaping its cage. The occasional infected stumbled into view, but they were fast, dodging them with ease. For now. As they approached the highway on-ramp, Larry saw the city's skyline in the distance, a jagged line of teeth against the night sky. The infection had claimed it all. His heart pounded as he stepped on the gas, the car lurching up the ramp. The highway stretched before them, a river of asphalt leading to what? Safety? Or just more of the same nightmare? The engine roared louder, the car's ancient suspension protesting the speed. They were racing the infection, the two of them against the world, or what was left of it. They didn't know what was ahead, only what was behind. A city lost to madness, a woman's sacrifice, and the ever-present fear of the bite that would turn them into monsters. But for now, they had a car, a plan, and each other. And in the grim world of the infected, that was more than most people could say. The highway was eerily quiet, the usual cacophony of honking horns and squealing brakes replaced by the mournful wail of the wind. Larry's eyes remained glued to the road, his instincts honed by a lifetime of dodging trouble. Mike held tight to his seatbelt, his eyes never leaving the side mirrors, watching for any sign of pursuit. They saw a few other vehicles, but they were all abandoned, doors open, engines cold. It was as if everyone had simply disappeared, leaving behind their metal cocoons to rust in the embrace of the deserted streets. The silence was broken only by the distant howls of the infected, a constant reminder of the horror they'd left behind. As they drove, the infection grew more apparent. Cars were overturned, buildings smoldered, and bodies lay scattered like forgotten toys. The once bustling city of Detroit had become a ghost town, haunted by the ravenous dead. The sight was surreal, a testament to the speed and ferocity with which the disease had ravaged the city. They drove for hours, their nerves stretched taut like guitar strings. The only sound was the hum of the engine and their own ragged breathing. The needle of the gas gauge hovered just above empty, a silent sentinel of their dwindling chances. The horizon grew lighter, hinting at the approach of a new day, but the promise of safety remained elusive. Finally, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, they spotted a gas station up ahead. It looked untouched, a beacon of civilization in a sea of chaos. Larry's foot grew heavy on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward with newfound urgency. But as they pulled in, they saw the pumps were surrounded by a group of the infected, their eyes fixed hungrily on the approaching car. The woman had said to stay in the car, to avoid contact with the infected at all costs. But they needed gas, and with every passing second, their chances of making it out of the city grew slimmer. Larry looked to Mike, who nodded grimly. They had to make a stand. They had to survive. The two men grabbed what they could from the car, a tire iron, a crowbar, and a baseball bat they found in the trunk. The infected stumbled closer, their growls growing louder. Larry's hand was steady as he opened the door, the cold metal of the bat comforting in his grip. They stepped out into the new day, ready to fight for their lives. The battle was swift and brutal. The infected were strong, driven by a hunger that seemed to override any sense of pain or fear. Larry swung the bat with all his might, cracking skulls and shattering bones. Mike wielded the crowbar with a ferocity born of desperation, each swing sending a spray of blood and gore into the air. They worked together, a well-oiled machine of survival, their movements synchronized by the rhythm of their fear. When the last of the creatures lay twitching on the ground, they paused, chests heaving. The gas pump stood before them, a silent prize in the early morning light. They moved quickly, filling the tank and checking the station's convenience store for supplies. They found canned food, bottled water, and a first aid kit, but little else of use. Time was running out, and the infection was gaining ground. They climbed back into the car, the silence of the gas station a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just endured. Larry looked over at Mike, his face a mask of grim determination. "We're gonna make it," he said, his voice hoarse. Mike nodded, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. They both knew it was a lie, but in that moment, it was the only truth they had. They hit the road again, the sun rising in a bloody crescent over the city's ruins. The highway stretched before them, a ribbon of hope in a world gone mad. They didn't know where they were going, or if anywhere was safe, but they had each other and the will to live. And as the infected grew more numerous and the gas gauge dipped closer to empty, they drove on into the heart of the apocalypse, searching for a way out. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. I sat in my armchair, a relic of a simpler time, my eyes glued to the peephole in the front door. Outside, the once thriving suburb lay eerily still. The only sounds piercing the silence were the occasional distant screams and the falling of feet that grew closer every night. For a week, I'd been trapped in this fortress of solitude, my heart racing with every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 3 a.m. in a silent taunt. I'd been rationing food, but the grumbles in my stomach were growing more insistent. My pantry was a sad testament to my dwindling supplies. A few cans of soup, some stale crackers, and a half-eaten jar of peanut butter. The thought of stepping outside filled me with a cold dread, but I knew I couldn't hide much longer. My Glock 19, a cold weight in my hand, had become an extension of myself. With only 9 bullets left, each one represented a potential escape from the ravenous monsters that lurked outside. I'd used 3 to protect myself when they'd found me once before. 6 remained, and I wasn't eager to test their effectiveness again. The decision was made for me when the power went out for the 3rd time that week. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. In the pitch dark, the sounds grew louder, more ominous. It was now or never. I strapped on the holster and slid the last of the bullets into the chamber, feeling the metal click into place. My hand trembled as I turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a moonlit nightscape. I stepped out into the cold, my eyes darting in every direction, searching for any sign of movement. The air was thick with the scent of fear and decay, a noxious reminder of the world's transformation. The quiet was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that awaited beyond my front porch. As I descended the steps, the crunch of gravel echoed through the night. Each step was a silent prayer, a hope that I could remain unnoticed. The neighbor's house loomed ahead, a potential goldmine of supplies. I had to move fast. The streets were a minefield of shadows, every one of them a possible hiding place for the infected. I clutched the gun tightly, my knuckles white, as I approached the house. The door was ajar, and a faint light spilled onto the lawn. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and pushed it open. The sight that greeted me was one I'll never forget. The living room was in shambles, furniture overturned and blood spattered on the walls. My heart pounded in my ears as I moved through the wreckage, trying to be as silent as the monsters that had left it behind. In the kitchen, I found what I was looking for, a half-empty pantry, but it was better than what I had. I gathered what I could, shoving canned goods into a backpack. The clatter of glass underfoot sent a jolt of terror up my spine. I froze, listening for any sign that I'd been heard. The silence was shattered by a guttural growl from upstairs. It was close. Too close. The creature was moving towards the stairs. I knew I had seconds before it descended upon me. With a burst of adrenaline, I dashed for the back door. As I reached for the handle, a hand grabbed my arm, the grip stronger than any human's should be. I whipped around, the gun pointing at a set of eyes that gleamed with an unearthly hunger. The creature that had once been my neighbor stumbled towards me, drooling and snarling. My finger hovered over the trigger, the weight of the decision heavy on my soul. But survival trumped mercy in this new world, and I pulled it without hesitation. The gunshot rang through the house, echoing down the empty streets. Now, there were only 5 bullets left. 5 chances to stay alive. 5 reasons to run. I shoved the door open and sprinted into the night, my heart racing faster than my legs could carry me. The creature's cry grew fainter as I put more distance between us, but I knew others would come, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. I had to find somewhere safe, somewhere I could hide until the danger passed. But where could I go? The world had become a prison, and I was the only inmate still uninfected. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. The only thing that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other, getting away from the monsters that had claimed the night. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned the corner, my eyes straining to make out any sign of refuge. A car, abandoned and smoldering, blocked the road ahead. Without thinking, I veered into the nearest alley, the darkness swallowing me whole. The narrow passage was a maze of dumpsters and shadowy figures that could have been anything from a pile of trash to an infected lurker. I held my breath, listening for the faintest sound of pursuit. The alley grew narrower, the walls closing in on me like the jaws of a beast waiting to devour me whole. Then, a glimmer of hope. A faint light flickered from the end of the alley, spilling out from a small convenience store. The neon sign above the door read, "Open," a beacon in the hellish nightscape. I stumbled towards it, the promise of salvation in my grasp. Inside, the store was a mess, shelves picked clean of food and supplies. The cashier lay slumped behind the counter, the once bright lights now flickering like a dying heartbeat. I moved through the aisles, my flashlight beam dancing over the wreckage. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. They were here. My hand clamped down on the gun, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I ducked behind the counter, the cold floor tiles a stark contrast to my feverish skin. The footsteps grew closer, the shuffling gait of the infected unmistakable. My hand tightened around the gun, the metal warm and slick with sweat. I took a deep breath and held it, counting the steps. 1, 2, 3. The creature appeared in the doorway, eyes glowing with hunger. It was a woman, or at least it had been. Her clothes were torn, her face a twisted mask of rage and pain. I didn't hesitate. 4 bullets left. The shot rang out, piercing the quiet like a scream. The woman dropped to the floor, but the sound had attracted more of them. They were coming from all sides now, a horde drawn to the siren call of fear and desperation. I had to get to the back room, find something, anything to help me survive. The gunshots had bought me a few precious moments, but I knew they wouldn't hold off the swarm for long. The door to the storage room was locked, but panic fueled my strength. I slammed my shoulder into it, once, twice, and on the third try, it gave way. I slipped inside, dragging the shelves in front of the entrance. It wouldn't hold them for long, but every second counted. The room was a cluttered mess, but amidst the boxes and debris, I found a can of gasoline and a box of matches. A plan, desperate and dangerous, began to form in my mind. If I couldn't escape, I'd take as many of these monsters with me as I could. The pounding on the makeshift barricade grew louder, more insistent. I knew my time was running out. With trembling hands, I doused the floor and the shelves, the acrid smell of gasoline burning my nostrils. 3 bullets. The first match scraped against the box, igniting with a fierce spark. I threw it, watching as the flames grew, licking at the shelves. The room filled with the sound of snarls and roars as the creatures outside realized their prey had turned into a predator. 2 bullets. The fire spread rapidly, the heat searing my face as the first of them broke through. I leveled the gun, my eyes locked on the burning doorway. 1 bullet. The room was engulfed in flames now, the heat a living entity consuming everything in its path. The creatures stumbled into the inferno, blinded by the fire. 1 bullet. I took a deep breath, my heart racing. I had to make this count. The nearest one lunged at me, its eyes aflame with rage and hunger. I fired, the shot echoing through the chaos. 0 bullets. The creature fell, lifeless, and with it, my hope of escape. The flames grew higher, the heat unbearable. I had to move, fast. I stumbled through the burning store, the smoke thick and choking. The fire had spread, trapping me in a fiery prison of my own making. Through the flames, I saw the back door, the one I'd ignored in my haste to find refuge. It was my only way out. I pushed aside the burning shelves, the heat intense, my eyes streaming with tears. The wooden door was hot to the touch, but fear gave me the strength to push harder. It swung open with a screech, revealing a night sky that seemed even more ominous than before. The alley was clear, the infected distracted by the blaze. I took a step outside, the cool air a stark contrast to the inferno behind me. My lungs gasped for breath, desperate for air that didn't taste of ash and fear. The sirens grew louder, a symphony of horror that filled the night. I knew what they meant. More of the infected were on their way, drawn by the light and the sound like moths to a flame. I had to get as far from the fire as I could, fast. I sprinted down the alley, the flaming store casting a flickering glow on the pavement. My eyes searched for an escape route, a place to hide. The world outside my house had become a labyrinth of danger, each turn a gamble with death. As the sirens grew closer, the shadows grew denser, and I heard the shuffling of feet again. My heart hammered in my chest, the beat a frantic rhythm that matched the pulse of the flaming world around me. The alley opened up onto a main road, deserted except for a single car, its engine still purring. The keys dangled from the ignition, a gift from the gods of survival. Without a second thought, I jumped in and turned the key. The engine roared to life, the headlights piercing the gloom. The car was a battered old station wagon, but it was my ticket to freedom. I peeled out onto the road, the tires screeching. The flaming convenience store was a beacon of destruction behind me, a stark reminder of the life I'd left behind. I had no map, no destination, just the instinct to get as far away from the chaos as possible. The car's radio crackled with static, the occasional burst of a frantic news report telling of the spreading infection and the futile attempts to contain it. As I drove, the world outside the car windows grew more desolate. Houses were boarded up, their inhabitants either safe or lost. Cars were abandoned, their engines cold and silent. The only movement was the occasional shuffling of the infected, drawn to the distant wail of the sirens like mindless drones. The road stretched on, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. I had no idea where it would take me, but anywhere was better than here. My eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of life, a beacon of hope amidst the despair. In the rearview mirror, the fire grew smaller, a dwindling ember of the life I knew. The sirens grew fainter, swallowed by the night. But the silence was filled with a new terror, the knowledge that I was now truly alone in a world gone mad. The car's gas gauge hovered just above empty, a silent reminder of the precariousness of my situation. I had to find fuel, food, shelter, and answers. The world was now a game of survival, and I was playing with the deck stacked against me. But I had the will to live, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The first few hours on the road were a blur of dark trees and abandoned vehicles. The occasional streetlight flickered, casting eerie pockets of light in the inky blackness. I drove through a ghost town, the buildings looming like silent sentinels, their windows eyes that had seen too much horror. As dawn began to break, I saw the first signs of life, or what was left of it. Two figures stumbled into the road, their movements jerky and erratic. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. They were far enough away that I could still make out their faces, the faces of neighbors I used to wave to from my porch. My heart ached for them, for the lives they'd lost, for the people they'd never be again. But I knew I couldn't help them now. All I could do was keep moving, keep searching for a place that was still untouched by the madness. The sun rose, a weak, pale imitation of the warmth it had once brought. It cast a pallid light over the desolate landscape, revealing the full extent of the destruction. Cars were overturned, buildings smoldered, and the once tidy lawns were trampled and stained with blood. My stomach growled, a persistent reminder of my dwindling supplies. The last of my food had been consumed hours ago, and the thought of what might be waiting for me in the car was too much to bear. I pulled over at a gas station, the pump standing tall and silent, the lights flickering in a sad imitation of life. Inside, the glass was shattered, the shelves bare. The cash register lay open, a gaping maw that had swallowed the last of humanity's comforts. But there in the corner was a small stash of food that had been overlooked. A few cans of beans, a box of crackers, a bottle of water, and some loose 9mm bullets in a drawer. It wasn't much, but it was something. I took the supplies and retreated to the car, locking the doors, and reloaded the gun one more time. 4 bullets, 4 chances to keep the monsters at bay. I took a deep breath and continued down the road, my eyes peeled for any sign of life that didn't want to end mine. The radio static grew clearer, and I caught snatches of conversation. People were banding together, forming groups, finding safety in numbers. They spoke of safe zones, of military intervention. It was a glimmer of hope in a sea of despair. But the road grew more treacherous with each passing mile. The infected grew bolder, their numbers swelling as the sun climbed higher in the sky. I knew I couldn't drive forever, that eventually I'd have to find a place to rest, to hide. The car sputtered, the needle on the gas gauge kissing the red. My heart skipped a beat. I was so close to finding somewhere safe. But the world had other plans. The engine gave a final gasp before dying, leaving me stranded on the side of the road. The quiet was absolute, save for the distant groans of the creatures that now had my scent. I looked around, my eyes desperately searching for a place to run to, a place to hide. There was nothing but the endless stretch of road and the encroaching forest. And then I saw it, a glimmer through the trees. A house, its lights off, but its door untouched. With the food and the gun, I had a chance. I grabbed the backpack and my flashlight, and I stepped out of the car into the cold embrace of the new world. The forest loomed before me, a silent challenge. The underbrush tugged at my legs, the branches snagging my clothes as I stumbled through the trees. The sounds of the infected grew louder, their footsteps thudding like a drumline of doom. I broke through the trees and there it was, a 2-story house with a picket fence, the epitome of suburban life. It looked untouched by the chaos around it, a beacon of hope in a world gone mad. My hand reached for the door handle, the metal cool and solid beneath my trembling grip. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The house was a tomb, the silence so profound it seemed to pulse with malevolence. The air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and the faint odor of decay. The living room was untouched, the furniture arranged in a comforting pattern that seemed almost mocking in its normalcy. I moved quickly, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Each room was a potential hiding place, each corner a possible trap. The kitchen was a treasure trove of food, but the sight made my stomach churn. How long had it been since anyone had eaten here? The fridge was unplugged, the freezer a melted graveyard of spoiled meat and ice. I found a can opener and set to work on the beans, the sound of the metal lid peeling back echoing through the house like a gunshot. The food was cold, but I didn't dare risk a fire to warm it. I ate quickly, the taste of metal and fear coating my mouth. With the last bite, I realized the quiet had changed. It was no longer the deafening silence of an abandoned home. It was the watchful stillness of the hunted. My ears strained to pick up any sound, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the whispers of the wind. Then a faint creak, a footstep on the staircase. I clutched my gun, my eyes darting around the room. The house had become a prison, and I was the inmate waiting for the executioner's call. The door to the basement stood open, the darkness beyond it a yawning mouth. I had to go down there. It was the only place left to hide. With a deep breath, I descended the stairs, each step a silent prayer for safety. The basement was a cluttered mess, boxes piled high and a thick layer of dust coating everything. The air was damp and musty, the kind of air that clung to your lungs like a living thing. I found a spot behind the furnace, a tiny pocket of shadow that might just be enough to hide me. The footsteps grew louder, the house groaning as the creature moved through it. I could almost feel its hunger, a palpable presence that made my skin crawl. And then it stopped. I held my breath, the only sound the hammering of my heart in my ears. Suddenly the lights flickered to life, the bulbs casting a sickly yellow glow. The creature was standing at the top of the stairs, its eyes locked on the open basement door. I was trapped. My hand tightened around the gun, the metal cold and slick with sweat. 3 bullets, 3 chances to stay alive. I knew what I had to do. I took a deep breath, steeled my nerve, and stepped out into the open. The creature saw me, its eyes lighting up with a feral glee. It stumbled down the stairs, the sound of its approach like a death knell. I raised the gun, my hand steady despite the trembling in my chest. The creature was almost upon me when I fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. It staggered back, a hole in its forehead. The body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. 2 bullets left. The silence was shattered by the pounding of more footsteps, a cacophony of rage and hunger. They were coming from outside, drawn by the gunshot. The house was surrounded. Panic clawed at me, but I pushed it down. I had to think, had to find a way out. My eyes fell on the window, boarded up but not completely sealed. With trembling hands, I began to pry the wood loose, the splinters biting into my skin. The boards gave way with a groan, and I squeezed through the narrow gap, the glass shattering beneath me. Outside, the infected had gathered, a sea of twisted faces and gnashing teeth. The taste of freedom was sweet as I broke into a run, the wind cold on my face. The house was burning now, the fire I'd set in the kitchen a beacon in the night. The creatures were distracted, but they wouldn't be for long. I had to find a new place to hide, a new fortress against the horror that had claimed the world. The night was endless. the stars a mocking twinkle in the sky above. The road stretched out before me, a path of darkness that promised nothing but uncertainty. But I had 2 bullets, and I had hope, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to survive another day. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. On a sweltering Detroit evening, Larry McCoy, a burly man with a faded police badge, wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced around the abandoned convenience store. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the floor, littered with broken glass and overturned shelves. He was tired, but the fear in his eyes was as sharp as the shards underfoot. "Dad, what are we gonna do?" asked Timmy, his voice quivering. Larry's son was a carbon copy, just younger and greener. His uniform, once crisp and authoritative, was now wrinkled and stained with the grime of survival. "We stick to the plan," Larry said firmly, though his own fear was a living, breathing beast in the pit of his stomach. "We're going to Uncle Bob's, 10 blocks away. We've got to move fast and stay quiet." They stepped outside into the stifling heat. The city that never sleeps had gone silent, except for the occasional distant scream or moan. It was the second day of the outbreak, and the streets were a maze of abandoned cars and hastily constructed barricades. The once bustling metropolis had become a ghost town, haunted by the twisted forms of the infected. Timmy clutched his pistol tightly. "Remember, only shoot if we have to," Larry whispered, as much to himself as to his son. They had rifles slung over their shoulders, but bullets were precious. The sound of a gunshot could draw the wrong kind of attention. The father-son duo moved swiftly down the sidewalk, their eyes darting to every shadow, every open doorway. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear and the faint, sickly sweet smell of decay. Larry checked his phone, but it remained dark. The network had been down since yesterday. "How much water do we have left?" Timmy asked, his voice low. "Not enough," Larry replied, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "We'll find more." They had to. The thirst was already gnawing at them, a constant companion to the ever-present dread. They had to get to Uncle Bob's, but the journey was fraught with danger. The infected were everywhere, and the uninfected were just as unpredictable. As they turned a corner, a figure stumbled into view. Larry tensed, ready to draw his weapon, but the man's eyes were wild with terror, not the vacant hunger of the infected. "Help me," the stranger croaked, stumbling towards them. Larry's instinct was to assist, but his survival instinct was stronger. "Keep moving, Timmy," he murmured, pushing his son behind him. The man was a liability. They couldn't risk getting bogged down by someone who might not make it. But as they moved away, they heard the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet. The infected had found them. Larry grabbed Timmy's arm, and together they broke into a run, the thunder of their footsteps echoing down the empty street. The moan grew louder. Closer, they were being pursued. Their only hope was to reach Uncle Bob before the nightfall brought more horrors with it. The city was their enemy now, a concrete jungle with teeth made of despair. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows grew long and dark, whispering of the chaos to come. They sprinted down an alley, the smell of rotting garbage and fear thick in the air. Timmy stumbled, and Larry yanked him back up. "Keep up, son," he gritted, his eyes on the pursuing horde. The alley ended in a brick wall with a rusty metal fire escape leading up to an open window. Without a second thought, Larry boosted Timmy up, who scrambled inside. He followed closely, his breaths ragged. The room was dark and stale, but it was a welcome respite from the horror outside. They paused, listening for any sign of the infected. The silence was deafening. Larry peered through the dusty window, watching the street below for any movement. The alley was clear, but the main road was a swarm of twisted figures, stumbling over debris in their mindless pursuit. Timmy leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "We can't stay here," he panted. "They'll find us." Larry nodded, his mind racing. They had to move, but they had to be smart. They couldn't afford to be seen or heard. He checked their supplies. 2 nearly empty water bottles, a few protein bars, and a handful of bullets. The pistols felt heavy at their sides, a constant reminder of their dwindling resources. They waited, hearts pounding, until the moon had climbed high enough to cast a silver glow upon the city. The infected had slowed, drawn perhaps by some other hapless soul's scent of life. Larry knew they couldn't wait much longer. The air was thick with the promise of rain, a rare mercy in the stifling heat, but it also meant the shadows would shift and move, providing them cover. They descended the fire escape, the metal groaning in protest. Larry's eyes swept the street, his hand resting on his holster. He whispered the plan into Timmy's ear. They'd stay in the shadows, moving from one derelict building to the next, using the moonlight to navigate. It was a risky gambit, but it was their only chance. They set off, their steps light and silent on the cracked asphalt. The air was charged with electricity, the anticipation of the storm, and the ever-present fear of discovery. As they approached Uncle Bob's street, the first drops of rain began to fall, cooling their skin but also muffling their footsteps. The buildings grew closer together, the windows boarded up with plywood, the doors reinforced with nails and chains. The house was in sight, a beacon of hope in the sea of despair. Larry's heart swelled with relief, but his instincts screamed at him to be cautious. The world had changed in the span of a single day, and trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. They approached the door, weapons drawn, ready to face whatever awaited them inside. The handle was cold and firm. Larry took a deep breath, whispered a silent prayer, and pushed it open. The door creaked, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. They stepped inside, the darkness enveloping them. "Uncle Bob?" Timmy called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of their own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. They moved through the house, their flashlights piercing the gloom. The furniture was overturned, drawers emptied, and the fridge left wide open. The smell of spoiled food mingled with the metallic stench of blood. In the living room, they found him. Uncle Bob was slumped in his chair, his eyes vacant, a crimson stain spreading from his neck. His hand clutched a baseball bat, the only weapon he'd had against the infection. The TV flickered with the emergency broadcast, the same message that had been playing on repeat for hours. "Stay inside, stay safe, help is on the way." Larry's knees buckled, and Timmy's hand tightened around his pistol. The rain outside grew heavier, the drops pounding against the windows like the drums of a funeral march. They had lost their sanctuary, their guide to safety. Now, they were truly alone in a city of monsters. But the storm brought with it a strange reprieve. The sound of the rain seemed to mask their footsteps and muffle the inhuman growls from outside. They moved swiftly, their eyes adjusting to the dimness, searching for any clue to Uncle Bob's fate or where they could find refuge. Larry's flashlight beam danced over the shattered glass and overturned furniture, painting the scene in stark contrasts of light and shadow. Timmy's hand trembled as he held his flashlight, casting erratic patterns on the blood-spattered walls. "Dad," he whispered, his voice tight with fear, "what do we do now?" Larry took a moment to compose himself, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. He knew they had to keep moving, had to find a new place to hole up. "We keep going, Timmy. We stick together and keep looking." They moved through the house, each room a silent testament to Uncle Bob's desperate struggle. The stairs creaked ominously as they ascended to the second floor. The bathroom door was ajar, the tub filled with a crimson pool of water, evidence of a futile attempt to wash away the infection. In the bedroom, they found a map of the city, marked with hasty X's and arrows. Larry studied it, his brow furrowed, trying to discern a pattern or a destination. It was clear Uncle Bob had been preparing an escape plan, but it had been cut short. The rain outside grew into a deluge, the windows rattling in their frames. Timmy's light flickered across a half-eaten sandwich on the nightstand, the bread soggy and the meat congealed. "We need to eat something," he murmured, his voice a stark reminder of their dwindling supplies. Larry nodded grimly. They split the sandwich, the act of eating feeling almost sacred in the face of such deprivation. The food was stale, but it filled the void in their stomachs. They gathered what they could, a few cans of food from the kitchen, some bottles of water from the fridge. The house had been picked clean of everything else. With the storm raging outside, the infected had retreated to the shadows, giving them a brief respite. But the rain also brought a new challenge. The streets would be slippery, the visibility poor. They had to find shelter before the storm's fury was unleashed in full. They decided to make for the nearest police station, hoping to find supplies and information. The trek was fraught with danger, but Larry felt a glimmer of hope. If they could make it there, they might stand a chance of surviving this nightmare. The rain pummeled down on them as they sprinted through the streets, the water mixing with the sweat and grime on their faces. They clung to the shadows, the flashlights off, relying on the moon's pale glow to guide them. The world had become a blur of wet concrete and shadowy figures, both living and dead. The police station loomed ahead, a bastion of safety amidst the chaos. But as they approached, Larry heard it, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. His heart sank. The station was not the refuge they had hoped for. It was a battleground. They ducked into an alley, hiding behind a dumpster. The sound grew louder, closer. Timmy's grip on his father's arm tightened. "Dad," he whispered, his eyes wide. "What now?" Larry took a deep breath, the taste of rain and despair in his mouth. He knew they had to keep moving, to find a new place to hide. But the city was closing in on them, its jaws snapping shut. He glanced at the map, searching for an alternative, his mind racing. And that's when he saw it, a small, unmarked X, 2 blocks away. A place Uncle Bob had known, a place they hadn't considered. "We have to check it out," he said, his voice firm. It was a gamble, but it was the only play they had left. They moved through the alley, the rain now a torrent. The gunfire grew fainter, replaced by the rhythmic patter of rainwater bouncing off the pavement. The unknown beckoned them, a siren's call through the storm. Suddenly, a flash of movement at the alley's end. Larry's heart skipped a beat as a horde of infected stumbled into view, drawn by the promise of fresh prey. He shoved Timmy behind him, his pistol at the ready. They had to act fast. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice taut with tension. "I'll draw them off." Timmy's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. Larry took a deep breath and stepped into the open. The infected spotted him immediately, their groans rising to a fever pitch. He fired, the muzzle flash briefly lighting up the night. The creatures stumbled and fell, but there were too many. "Come on!" he roared, and the creatures surged forward. Timmy took his chance, sprinting towards the police station. Larry fired again, dropping several more before he had to turn and run, the horde at his heels. They burst into the station's lobby, the glass door shattering under the weight of the infected. Larry slammed it shut, the frame buckling. "We need to hold them off," he shouted, his eyes scanning the room for anything to barricade the door. They found a desk and shoved it against the entrance, the wood splintering as the infected slammed into it. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Larry knew it wouldn't hold for long. They dashed down a hallway, the echo of their footsteps bouncing off the cold, sterile walls. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced like ghosts. The sounds of the infected grew distant, but the fear remained a living, breathing entity between them. They reached the armory, a small room filled with weapons and ammo. Larry's eyes lit up with relief as he grabbed a couple of boxes of bullets and shoved them into Timmy's arms. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice tight. "We've got to keep moving." They reloaded their weapons, the sound of the bullets clicking into place a grim melody. The door to the armory rattled ominously. The infected had found them again. With no other option, they barricaded themselves inside. Larry's mind raced, searching for an escape plan. They had to find a way out before the horde broke through. Timmy's eyes met his, filled with a mix of terror and determination. "We can do this, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Larry nodded, his heart swelling with pride. Together they'd fight for each other, for their lives. They'd find a way out of this hellish night. He hoped. The rattling grew louder, the wood starting to splinter. Larry took a deep breath, aimed his pistol at the door, and whispered, "On my signal." The moment the door gave way, they'd make their stand. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tumult inside their hearts. They were the last bastion of hope in a city gone mad, and they'd fight tooth and nail to keep it that way. As the wood began to crack, Larry gave the signal. Timmy's finger tightened on the trigger, and the room exploded with the sound of gunfire. Bullets tore through the splintered door, sending the infected reeling back into the hallway. Larry stepped through the wreckage, pistol blazing. Timmy followed, his rifle a steady beat of death. The creatures fell, one by one, their cries of hunger silenced. The air grew thick with smoke and the stench of gunpowder. Larry's ears rang from the deafening noise, his eyes watered from the smoke, but he couldn't let up. They had to be sure. Finally, the onslaught ceased. The hall was clear, littered with the twitching forms of the defeated. They didn't dare to breathe a sigh of relief yet. Larry grabbed the radio from the desk, his hands shaking. "This is Officer Larry McCoy," he said into the static. "Does anyone read me?" The hiss of the radio was the only response. He tried again, his voice strained. "We're at the 15th precinct. Anyone out there? Over." A crackle, and then a voice, faint and distant. "Larry, is that you?" It was Bob, their uncle. He was alive. The wave of relief that washed over them was short-lived, however, as the voice grew clearer. "They're everywhere. I can't hold out much longer. Tell Timmy I love him. Goodbye." The line went dead. The blood drained from Larry's face. Timmy's eyes searched his, looking for answers he didn't have. The silence was shattered by the sound of the door being pounded from the other side. They had to move, now. They sprinted through the station, Larry's mind racing. They couldn't stay here, not with the infected so close. They needed a new plan, a new destination. They had to find others, survivors like themselves. As they rounded a corner, they stumbled upon a map of the city. It was a mess of scribbled notes and red X's, but it was better than nothing. Larry's eyes fell on a nearby location, a small dot of hope in the chaos. "We're going to the hospital," he decided. "It's our best shot." The hospital was a fortress, and if anyone had managed to hold out against the tide of infection, it would be there. They had to get there, had to find a doctor, had to find a way to stop this. The thought of their uncle's fate only served to fuel their determination. They made their way through the darkened corridors, the echoes of their footsteps the only sound. The air was stale, the smell of fear and sickness lingering like a malevolent specter. The pounding grew fainter as they put more distance between themselves and the precinct, but they knew it wasn't over. The city was their enemy, and it wasn't giving up. They had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the storm and the creatures it brought. They had to find a cure, or at least a way to slow the infection's spread. The rain outside had become a symphony of despair, a mournful tune for the lost and the damned. The hospital loomed ahead, a tower of salvation in the foggy night. The lights flickered in the windows, a beacon in the dark. Larry clutched Timmy's shoulder, his grip firm. "We're almost there, son," he said, trying to convince himself as much as his boy. "We're going to be okay." The words felt hollow, but they had to hold on to something. They couldn't let the fear win. As they approached the hospital doors, they steeled themselves for what awaited them inside. They had no idea if they'd find refuge or a new battleground, but they had no other choice. They pushed the doors open, the storm's fury retreating momentarily. The hospital's lobby was a tableau of chaos, overturned chairs, broken glass, and a discarded stretcher. The emergency room was a ghostly sight, the once bustling area now eerily silent. Larry's eyes fell on a note, hastily scrawled and left on the reception desk. "Quarantine. 3rd floor. Do not enter without clearance." His heart sank. The hospital was not the safe haven they had hoped for. The air was thick with a mix of antiseptic and something else, something foul. They moved up the stairs, each step echoing through the empty halls. The 3rd floor was a labyrinth of shadows and the occasional flickering light. They had to be careful. They found the quarantine ward, the door ajar. Larry nudged it open with the barrel of his gun, the smell of rotting flesh assaulting them. The room was a slaughterhouse, beds overturned and blood splattered across the walls. Timmy gagged, bile rising in his throat. They moved quickly, checking each room, but the place was deserted. The infected had either broken out or been contained elsewhere. In the doctor's office, they found what looked like a makeshift research lab. Papers littered the floor, charts and diagrams scattered. Larry picked up a notebook, flipping through the pages. The handwriting grew more erratic, the notes more desperate. The doctor had been trying to find a cure, but it was clear he had failed. Or perhaps he'd been overrun. "Dad," Timmy whispered, his voice shaking. "Look." He pointed to a security monitor, the screen flickering with static. Through the snow, they could make out a group of survivors huddled together, surrounded by the infected. One was Uncle Bob, his face drawn and tired but alive. The image was a lifeline in the sea of despair. Larry's eyes narrowed, determination setting in. "We have to find them," he said, the urgency in his voice palpable. The map on the wall caught his attention. It was marked with various locations around the city, some with the same symbol they had found on Uncle Bob's map. It was a trail of breadcrumbs, leading to a place called the Sanctuary. They gathered what supplies they could find: medical supplies, more ammo, and a handful of grenades. The storm outside had turned into a cacophony of wind and rain, but the hospital was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant moan. They knew the infected could be anywhere, waiting in the shadows. They descended the stairs back into the storm. The journey to the sanctuary would not be easy, but they had no choice. They had to find the others, had to survive. As they stepped out into the night, the wind howling around them, Larry turned to Timmy. "Stay close," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We're in this together." They sprinted across the parking lot, dodging abandoned cars, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The rain stung their faces, mixing with their sweat and the ever-present fear. They had to be careful. The infected could be anywhere. The hospital was behind them now, a grim reminder of the world that was. The city was a battleground, the buildings looming like skeletal sentinels. They stuck to the shadows, moving from one piece of cover to the next. The storm raged on, the rain a torrent that washed the blood from the streets, but not the horror. The night was alive with the sounds of the infected, the cries of the lost, and the distant wail of sirens that had long since lost their meaning. Their destination grew closer, the tension between them tightening like a noose. The sanctuary was their only hope, the last beacon of light in a world consumed by darkness. And as they approached the final block, the rain began to ease, the storm giving way to a tense calm. The silence was almost deafening. The building loomed ahead, a fortress in the night. Larry's heart raced as he spotted a figure on the rooftop, a rifle trained on them. "Hold it," the voice called out, firm and authoritative. "Who goes there?" Larry took a step forward, his hand up in a non-threatening gesture. "Police officers," he called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "We're looking for survivors. We have information." The figure didn't move, the rifle unwavering. "What information?" "We know where more survivors are," Larry shouted. "Our Uncle Bob, he's with a group nearby. We need to get to them." The figure on the rooftop was still for a moment, then lowered the rifle. A second later, a side door to the building creaked open. They rushed inside, the warmth of the shelter a stark contrast to the cold, wet hell they'd been navigating. The door slammed shut behind them, and the lock clicked into place. A woman in military fatigues, her eyes hard and assessing, stepped into the light. "Follow me," she barked. They were led through a warren of corridors and stairs to the basement. The air grew warmer, more humid, and the smell of fear and desperation grew stronger. They passed by makeshift living spaces, the occasional sob piercing the air. The basement was packed with survivors, all huddled together, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had seen. The woman, who introduced herself as Captain Ramirez, brought them to a small, cramped room. "The others are in here," she said, opening the door. The room was filled with the coughs and whimpers of the sick and injured. In the corner, Larry spotted Uncle Bob, his eyes glazed over with fever. Timmy rushed to his side, his voice cracking with emotion. "Uncle Bob." The man looked up, his expression one of disbelief and relief. "You made it," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "They said I was hallucinating." Larry knelt beside him, his heart heavy. The infection had claimed him too. They had to find a doctor, or at least some medical supplies. "We'll get you help," he promised, though his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, they were all out of options. But as he said the words, the sound of shuffling feet echoed through the basement. The infected had found them. The survivors looked around, panic setting in. Captain Ramirez barked orders, the room descending into chaos. Larry knew they couldn't stay here. They had to find a way out. They gathered their meager supplies, the few items they had brought with them from the precinct and the hospital. The group was a mix of police officers, hospital staff, and civilians who had banded together. They had to move quickly before the infected overran their sanctuary. They retraced their steps through the basement, the shuffling growing louder. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the stench of the creatures. Larry's heart hammered in his chest, his grip tight on Timmy's hand. They couldn't fail now, not after coming so far. As they approached the stairs leading to the main floor, Larry spotted a maintenance shaft. Without hesitation, he pushed open the heavy metal door, the hinges screeching in protest. "In here," he ordered, his voice low but firm. The group followed, cramming into the tight space. The shaft was a claustrophobic tunnel of darkness and dust. They climbed, their breaths echoing in the metal chamber. The sounds of the infected grew fainter with each rung they climbed. The shaft opened into the hospital's ventilation system, a maze of ducts and air shafts. They crawled through the tight space, the air thick with the scent of fear and sweat. The vent rattled as the creatures approached, but held firm. The sound grew closer, the thud of their fists against the metal, a drumbeat of dread. They had to keep moving, had to find a way out before they were discovered. Larry's mind raced, trying to piece together the layout of the hospital from his brief visit earlier. They had to be close to the roof where the ventilation system would lead. Finally, they reached an opening, the cold night air rushing in. They pushed through the vent cover, the rain a cold slap in the face. They were on the roof, the city a sea of darkness and despair beneath them. The rain had cleared the air, but the silence was broken by the distant wails of the infected. The survivors huddled together, the reality of their situation setting in. They had nowhere to go, no plan but to keep moving. The rain had stopped, but the chill in the air was a stark reminder of the cold truth. They were exposed. Larry took stock of their group. Captain Ramirez, 2 other officers, a doctor, and 3 nurses from the hospital. They were a ragtag bunch, but they had each other's backs. They had to. The city was a graveyard, its streets a minefield of the infected. They decided to split up, the officers and Larry forming one team to find a safe route out of the city, while the doctor and nurses would stay behind to treat Uncle Bob and the other sick. It was a risk, but it was their best chance. They had to find help, had to find a way to stop this infection from spreading. Timmy's eyes searched his father's, the fear and hope mingling like the rain and the bloodstains on their clothes. "We'll be back," Larry assured him, his voice strong. "We'll find a cure." They descended the fire escape, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The world had gone mad, but they had to keep their sanity. They had to hold on to hope. The city was a labyrinth of shadows, the buildings towering above them like silent giants. They moved swiftly, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. The occasional scream pierced the night, a reminder of the horrors they faced. They encountered other survivors, some hostile, some desperate. They had to make quick decisions, to trust or to flee. The city had become a jungle, and trust was a commodity in short supply. They gathered information, piecing together a patchwork of rumors and half-truths. There was talk of a cure, of a group that had figured out how to fight back. As they moved closer to the city's outskirts, the signs of life grew fewer. The buildings grew more dilapidated, the streets more treacherous. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the acrid tang of burnt rubber. The world had ended, and they were the last to know. Their journey was fraught with danger, their path littered with the remnants of the city's fall. They found supplies in the most unlikely of places, a small convenience store with the doors barricaded but the goods untouched. They took what they could, leaving behind a message for any who followed. Survivors, headed to the checkpoint. The checkpoint was a ghost town, the barricades abandoned. Larry's heart sank. Had they been too late? Had the infection spread this far? They pushed on, the silence of the night their only company. And then, in the distance, a flicker of light, a fire, a camp. They approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. The light grew brighter, revealing a group of figures huddled around the flames. One looked up, a rifle trained on them. "Who goes there?" the voice called out, echoing through the night. Larry took a step forward, his hand raised. "Friendly," he called back, his voice steady. "We're survivors from the city, looking for help, for a cure." The figure lowered the rifle slightly. "You're police," he said, eyeing them. "What's your business here?" "Our uncle's back at the hospital," Larry said, his voice tight. "He's infected. We're looking for anything that can help us." The man, bearded and weary, studied them for a moment before waving them over. The camp was a small group of tents, a few vehicles parked haphazardly. People huddled around the fire, their eyes wary. "Name's Marcus," he said, extending a hand. The night passed in a blur of conversation and makeshift medical treatments. The doctor, a weary woman named Dr. Jenkins, worked tirelessly to treat Uncle Bob and the others. Larry and Timmy took turns watching over him, their eyes never leaving his feverish face. As dawn broke, the camp buzzed with activity. The survivors packed their meager supplies, their faces a mix of hope and fear. The convoy was a ragtag collection of vehicles, each one patched up and ready for the journey ahead. They set off, the engines roaring a defiant challenge to the quiet streets. The city was a wasteland, but they had a mission. They had to get Uncle Bob to the doctor, had to find a way to stop this infection. The drive was fraught with danger. The infected roamed the streets, drawn to the sound of engines. They had to fight their way through, the bullets flying and the tires squealing. The convoy grew smaller as vehicles broke down or were overrun, but they didn't stop. Days turned into weeks, the horizon a blur of road and despair. They encountered other groups, some friendly, some not. They picked up survivors along the way, each one adding to their story. The convoy grew, a beacon of hope in the apocalypse. But the infection grew stronger, the cities they passed through more and more desolate. The radio crackled with static, the occasional message of a safe haven or a warning of a new outbreak. The world outside was dying, and they were racing against the clock. And then, one night, the sky lit up with an unearthly glow. The infected grew more agitated, their numbers swelling. The group huddled around the fire, their faces etched with fear. "What is that?" Timmy whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's the end," someone murmured. But Larry knew it wasn't. It was a new beginning, a harbinger of the battle to come. They had to be ready, had to keep fighting. "We can't give up," he said, his voice firm. "We've come too far." The group nodded, their resolve solidifying in the face of the unknown. They had each other, and they had hope. And in this new world, that was all they needed. The convoy pushed on, the glow in the sky a constant reminder of the horrors they left behind. But ahead, the promise of salvation called, a siren's song that grew louder with every mile. They had to reach it, had to find a way to end this nightmare. The road grew steeper, the trees denser, the air grew colder, the snow beginning to fall. The world outside was dying, but within the warmth of the vehicles, they held on to life. And then, through the trees, they saw it. A fence, a gate, and beyond that, a beacon of light. The sanctuary, a place of refuge and hope. The end of their journey, or the beginning of the fight. They approached the gate, their hearts pounding. The infected were everywhere, their eyes glowing with an unearthly hunger. The gate creaked open, and they drove through, the metal sliding shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the night. The sanctuary was a fortress, a bastion of light in the darkened world. But even as Larry and Timmy stepped from the car, the air felt wrong. A cold sweat broke out on Larry's brow as he turned to see Uncle Bob stumble from the shadows, his eyes a sickly yellow, his skin slick with feverish sweat. The infection had taken hold. Timmy's grip on his pistol tightened, his breath shallow and ragged. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, Uncle Bob." But it wasn't Uncle Bob anymore. The man Larry had known, the man who had taught him to fish and laugh and live, was gone. In his place was a creature, a monster driven by the hunger of the infection. It stumbled towards them, groaning, its jaws snapping. "Do it," Larry said, his voice hoarse. "Do it now." Timmy's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes never leaving Uncle Bob's. The shot rang out, echoing through the stillness of the camp. Uncle Bob's body jerked, then collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The survivors around them stared in shock, the horror of what had just happened etched on their faces. Larry stepped forward, his hand on Timmy's shoulder, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "You did what you had to," he murmured. Timmy nodded. but the tremor in his hands belied his words. They had lost so much, and now they had lost their last link to the life they knew. But they had a mission, a promise to keep. They had to find the doctor, had to stop the infection from claiming more lives. The doctor, a stoic woman named Dr. Keller, took the news in silence. She had seen too much death, too much suffering. But she nodded, her eyes hardening with determination. "We'll keep fighting," she said, "for him, for all of us." The camp was a hive of activity, survivors moving with a newfound purpose. They had a doctor, a leader, and a plan. They would fortify the sanctuary, make it a bastion of hope against the tide of the infected. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The infection raged outside, the moans and screams a constant reminder of the battle they faced. But within the walls of the sanctuary, they worked tirelessly, building defenses, forging weapons, and tending to the sick. Larry took up the mantle of protection, his pistol never far from his side. He patrolled the perimeter, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the infected. He knew they'd come, that it was only a matter of time. And then, one night, it happened. The alarm bells rang out, a shrill cry that pierced the frosty air. The infected had breached the outer walls. The camp was under siege. They fought with everything they had, the sound of gunfire and screams a cacophony of terror. Timmy, now a seasoned survivor, stood beside his father, his rifle firing in a steady rhythm. They had become a well-oiled machine, a bond forged in the crucible of the apocalypse. The battle was brutal, the night a canvas of fire and blood. The infected fell, but more took their place, a relentless tide of decay. Larry's mind raced, searching for a way to save the camp, to keep the infection from claiming more lives. And then he saw it, a flaw in the wall, a breach that could allow the infected to flood in. He shouted to Timmy, his voice a roar over the din of battle. "We have to seal it!" They ran, their boots crunching in the snow. The cold burned Larry's lungs, but he didn't falter. They reached the breach, a jagged gap in the metal. Larry grabbed a nearby explosive, his hands steady. "Cover me," he yelled. Timmy nodded, his rifle trained on the incoming horde. Larry set the charge, his heart racing. "Fire in the hole!" The explosion rocked the ground, the force sending a wave of heat through the cold air. The wall of flame and debris held back the infected, but not for long. The breach was sealed, but the price was high, the loss of their friends and allies. The camp was a battleground, littered with the fallen. Larry and Timmy, their faces streaked with soot and blood, searched the carnage for any sign of survivors. But there was none. The reality set in as the smoke cleared. The sanctuary had fallen. The infected had overrun the walls, their hunger insatiable. Larry felt a sharp pain in his side, a coldness spreading through his veins. He looked down to see teeth marks, the skin around them already turning a sickly gray. No, it couldn't be. Timmy's eyes grew wide with horror as he saw the bite. "Dad," he whispered, his voice choked, "you're infected." Larry's gaze met his son's, the love and fear in Timmy's eyes a mirror to his own. "We have to go," he said, his voice strained. "We can't stay here." They stumbled through the wreckage, their hearts heavy with grief. Larry knew what was coming, the inevitable transformation that would turn him into one of them. But he couldn't leave Timmy alone, not now. They found a car, the engine still running, the keys dangling in the ignition. It was a gift, a miracle amidst the horror. Larry climbed into the driver's seat, his strength already waning. "Take us out of here, son," he murmured. Timmy's hand trembled as he shifted the car into gear. The tires spun, finding purchase in the snow. They burst through the gates, the infected closing in. The car swerved and bounced over the uneven ground, a wild ride into the unknown. As they sped away from the ruins of the sanctuary, Larry felt the infection's grip tightening. The pain grew, his skin grew clammy, and his vision began to swim. Timmy's eyes never left the rearview mirror. The fear of what was to come etched deep. They found refuge in an abandoned farmhouse outside of the city. The quietness of the countryside, a stark contrast to the chaos they just fled. Larry could feel the change coming, the hunger gnawing at him from within. "Timmy," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you know what you have to do." Timmy's hand tightened around the rifle, the cold metal a stark reminder of his fate. "I won't leave you," he said, his voice shaking. "We're in this together." But Larry knew the truth. He had seen it too many times before. The infection was a merciless master, turning even the strongest of men into mindless beasts. He took a deep breath, fighting back the tears. "I'm sorry, son," he murmured, "but you can't save me. You have to save yourself." The farmhouse was cold and empty, the silence a mournful lullaby. They barricaded the doors and windows, their hearts racing. Larry sat on the floor, his back against the wall, watching the shadows dance in the flickering candlelight. Timmy sat beside him, his eyes never leaving his father's face. They talked of fishing trips and baseball games, of Christmases past and the future they had hoped for. It was a bittersweet symphony, a goodbye wrapped in a memory. As the night deepened, so did Larry's condition. The infection painted his skin in a sickly hue, his eyes glazed with the fever. "Do it," he choked out, his hand trembling as it reached for Timmy's. "Before it's too late." Timmy's eyes filled with tears as he raised the rifle. The weight of the world, of their shattered lives, rested on his shoulders. "I love you, Dad," he whispered. The shot rang out, echoing through the silent house. Larry's body slumped, the light leaving his eyes. Timmy fell to his knees, the gun slipping from his grip. He had killed his father, his hero, his protector. The grief was a physical ache, a scream trapped in his chest. But he knew it was the only way. The infection couldn't win, not today. Not when he had so much more to fight for. He stood, his resolve unbroken. He'd find the cure, he'd end this nightmare, for Larry, for Uncle Bob, for all the lives lost. The farmhouse door creaked open, the cold air whispering in. Timmy wiped the tears from his face, steeling himself. The world outside was still a horror show, but he had a mission now. He'd survive, and he'd find the doctor. For his father, for the promise of a future without fear. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but Timmy McCoy was a survivor, and survive he would. He took one last look at his father, a silent goodbye to the man who had taught him to be strong. And with that, he stepped into the night, the weight of his father's sacrifice propelling him forward. The moon cast long shadows across the snow, a solitary sentinel in the sky. He had a promise to keep, a battle to fight, and he would not be stopped. Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. Here we share spine-tingling stories that blend the thrill of horror with the calm of sleep, perfect for those who love a little fright before drifting off. If you love horror that lingers in the shadows of your mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more haunting bedtime stories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you're brave enough. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when a new nightmare has been unleashed. And before you let sleep take you, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to see how far our nightmares reach across the globe. Rest if you can. Now our story begins. In the sweltering heat of a Detroit summer evening, a young man named Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of the corner convenience store. He clutched a cold bottle of water in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling through messages from his mom, asking him to grab some milk. The street lamps flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cracked sidewalks. Marcus took a deep breath, savoring the sweet scent of barbecue ribs wafting from a nearby restaurant. It was a simple, familiar scene, yet something about the silence of the city felt off. Marcus had barely taken a sip when he heard the distant rumble of a school bus engine, followed by the screech of tires and the crunch of metal. His head snapped up in the direction of the noise, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw the Osborne High School bus careen off the road. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the bus was headed straight for the dilapidated brick building that housed his favorite arcade. Without thinking, he sprinted towards the accident. The bus had come to a stop, lodged at an odd angle against the side of the arcade. The door was hanging open, and a handful of dazed teens stumbled out, including Jace, Jaden, and Chase. Marcus recognized them as the stars of the football team, their jerseys still damp with sweat from the game. Coach Taylor lay unconscious in the driver's seat, the airbag deployed like a sad, deflated balloon. As he approached, Marcus heard a strange, guttural growling coming from within the bus. He exchanged a confused glance with Jace, who had moved to check on the coach. Suddenly, a player they all knew as Timmy stumbled out, his eyes wild and glazed over, froth bubbling from his mouth. Marcus took a step back, his hand tightening around the water bottle. Timmy's jaw was clenched, his teeth bared, and his arms outstretched as if he were about to pounce. Without warning, he lunged at Jaden, his teeth snapping together like a vice. Jaden's instincts kicked in, and he shoved Timmy back with a strength fueled by terror. The infected teen stumbled and hit the pavement with a sickening thud. The other students looked on in shock, their eyes wide and their breaths shallow. Marcus's mind raced as he took in the scene. Something was very wrong here, and it was spreading fast. The growling grew louder, and more players began to show signs of the infection. The air was thick with the scent of fear and the metallic tang of blood. This was no ordinary bus crash. This was the beginning of a nightmare. Adrenaline pumping, Jace took charge, his voice firm and steady amidst the chaos. "We have to get out of here," he said, his eyes darting around for any signs of safety. "Find somewhere to hide and call for help." Chase nodded, his eyes wide with fear, and the three of them bolted away from the bus. They sprinted down the desolate street, their cleats echoing off the brick walls. The only other sounds were the distant wails of sirens and the groaning of the metal beast that had been their ride home. They spotted a house with a flickering porch light a few blocks away and hoped it offered refuge. As they approached, the door was thrown open by a frantic woman. She looked at the boys with a mix of desperation and hope. "Help me," she screamed, her voice cracking. "My husband's been bitten." The boys didn't hesitate, rushing inside. The living room was a mess of overturned furniture and shattered glass. In the center, a man lay on the floor, his leg twitching spastically. His skin was pale, his eyes glazed over like Timmy's had been. The woman, Mrs. Castellanos, sobbed next to him, her hands stained with blood. Jaden's stomach turned as he took in the scene, but he knew they had to act fast. "We need to get him to a hospital," he said, his voice shaking. Mrs. Castellanos' eyes met his, filled with a sadness that spoke volumes. "It's too late," she whispered. "They're everywhere. We can't leave." The TV in the background flickered to life, showing news reports of similar incidents across the city. The words "infection outbreak" and "stay indoors" flashed across the screen, painting a grim picture of the horror unfolding around them. The house suddenly felt like a prison rather than a haven. Jace pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying over the screen as he tried to call his mom. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again, his heart racing as the same message played back. Jaden and Chase had similar luck. They were isolated, cut off from the outside world. The silence of the unanswered calls was deafening, echoing through the room. Panic began to set in, but Jace knew they couldn't give up. "We have to get home," he said, his eyes steely. "We'll stick together and find a safe route." The trio stepped out into the night, the humid air thick with the scent of burning rubber and the distant sound of chaos. They moved quickly but cautiously, staying in the shadows cast by the flickering streetlights. Every step brought a new sound that made their hearts race. A shuffling footstep, a distant howl, the shatter of breaking glass. They clung to each other, using their football instincts to stay alert and watch each other's backs. They saw the first of the infected staggering down the street, a man in a torn suit that had once been crisp and white. His eyes were sunken, his skin a sickly gray. He saw them and let out a guttural roar, his arms reaching for them with a terrifying urgency. The boys bolted, their muscles burning as they sprinted down the alleyways that crisscrossed the neighborhood. Behind them, the infected man gave chase, his movements jerky and unnatural. They had to keep moving, had to find a way to survive this nightmare. As they ran, Jace's mind worked overtime, trying to piece together a plan. "We'll head to the high school," he panted. "It's got to be safer there." Chase and Jaden nodded in agreement, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They had to trust that help would come, that somewhere in this city, someone was fighting back against the infection. The thought of their parents, their friends, and their teammates spurred them on, driving them through the night with a determination they didn't know they had. The journey was fraught with danger, but they had no choice but to press forward, one step at a time, into the heart of a horror none of them could have ever imagined. The streets grew more treacherous with each block. In the dim light, they saw more infected stumbling through the neighborhood. The once familiar sights of their city were now twisted into a macabre playground for the creatures that had once been their neighbors and friends. The boys stuck together, their football gear clattering as they moved in a tight formation, ready to take on whatever came next. They had been taught to face challenges head-on, to support each other, and to never quit. These lessons were now their only defense against the horror that surrounded them. They turned a corner and saw a family trapped in their car, the windows smashed in, the doors stuck. A mob of the infected was closing in, their snarls and growls growing louder with each second. Without hesitation, the three friends sprang into action. Jaden took the lead, using his broad shoulders to barge through the horde, knocking the creatures aside with brutal efficiency. Chase followed, his eyes sharp as he searched for any signs of danger, while Jace brought up the rear, ready to tackle any stragglers that got too close. The family inside the car was huddled together, the mother's hand over her daughter's mouth to muffle her screams. The father's eyes met Jace's, filled with a desperate plea for salvation. The boys worked quickly, using their football gear to fend off the attackers. Jaden's helmet connected with a sickening crunch against a creature's skull, and Chase's shoulder pads knocked another aside. They had to be careful not to harm the humans they were trying to save, but the infected showed no such restraint. The father managed to free the stuck door, and the family spilled out into the safety of their arms. "Thank you," the father choked out, his voice thick with relief. The mother clutched her daughter tightly, her eyes never leaving the boys. The little girl stared at them with wide eyes, her face streaked with tears. They had just become her heroes, her protectors in a world gone mad. Their victory was short-lived, though, as the sound of more approaching footsteps grew louder. The infected were closing in, drawn by the scent of the uninfected flesh. "We need to keep moving," Jace urged, his voice low and intense. They had a new responsibility now, and they couldn't fail this family. They picked up the pace, the sound of their cleats pounding the pavement, a rhythmic chant of survival. The high school was in sight, a beacon of hope in the nightmare that had become their reality. But the night was far from over, and the battle for their lives had just begun. As they reached the school's perimeter, the fence loomed tall and foreboding, topped with barbed wire that glinted in the moonlight. Beyond it, the football field lay empty, a stark contrast to the chaos of the city. "We can make it to the field," Chase suggested, pointing towards the open gate. "We can hold them off there." They had no other choice. They needed to find a way to signal for help, and the field would give them space to breathe. They dashed through the gate, the sound of the infected growing closer. The family followed closely, their eyes wide with fear. The field was a familiar place, a place of triumph and camaraderie, now transformed into a potential battleground. They made their way to the 50-yard line, the cool grass beneath their feet a stark contrast to the heat of the night. The stadium lights flickered on, illuminating the field in a harsh glow that cast long shadows across the turf. The infected spilled into the field like a tide of decay, their eyes locked on the living prey. The group huddled together, backs to the goalpost. Jace looked at his teammates, then to the family. They had to fight, for each other, for their families, for their city. With a roar of defiance, they readied themselves for the onslaught. The first wave hit them hard, a flurry of teeth and claws. Jace swung his helmet like a battering ram, knocking an infected woman back. Chase dodged and weaved, using his speed to stay out of reach, while Jaden's brute strength sent another creature flying. The family fought alongside them, using anything they could find as weapons: chunks of concrete, a forgotten baseball bat, and a metal rod from the fence. The night grew long, and the fight grew desperate. They could see more infected streaming towards the field, drawn by the commotion. The boys' muscles burned, their lungs screamed for air, but they didn't stop. The line they had drawn in the sand was clear. This was their home, their school, and they would not go down without a fight. As the first hints of dawn began to break through the horizon, the sound of distant gunfire and sirens grew louder. Help was on the way, but would it come in time? The battle raged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Their world had turned into a living hell, but as long as they had each other, they had hope. The sun's first rays painted the sky a fiery red, casting an eerie light over the battlefield that was once their pride and joy. Jace looked into Jaden and Chase's eyes, and he knew they were thinking the same thing. They had to survive this. They had to tell their story, to warn others, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to stop the infection from spreading. They had to make it to morning. With a renewed sense of purpose, they pushed back against the relentless tide of the infected. Each hit, each tackle, each scream of pain was a declaration of their will to live. The sun crept higher, the shadows retreating, and with it, the number of attackers began to thin. The first responders were close, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of salvation. The trio stood firm, their eyes never leaving the advancing line of monsters. As the first responders broke through the fence, guns blazing, the three friends and the Castellanos family collapsed to the ground, exhausted and traumatized. The world had changed in the blink of an eye, and they had become the unlikely heroes of a horror story playing out on their doorstep. But for now, as the sun rose over Osborne High School, they were alive, and that was all that mattered. After a brief but intense discussion, the trio made the difficult decision to split up. Despite Chase's pleas to stay together, Jace and Jaden were adamant. "We need to get to our families," Jaden said, his voice strained. "They're probably worried sick." Chase knew they were right. Their loved ones needed them, and the city was too vast to navigate as a group. The three of them shared a tense hug, feeling the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. They had been teammates, brothers on the field, but now they were parting ways, each to face the unknown alone. The Castellanos family clung to each other, their eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and dread for what was to come. Jace took a deep breath and nodded to his friends. "We'll meet back here if we can," he said, his voice firm. "If not, we'll find a way to survive." They each took off in opposite directions, their cleats pounding the pavement like a solemn drumbeat as they disappeared into the early morning light. The city was still, the only sounds the distant echoes of their footsteps and the occasional moan of the infected. The journey to Jace's house was a blur of fear and determination. He dodged through alleys and over fences, his thoughts racing faster than his legs. Each house he passed, each shadowy corner, could hide a new horror. His heart pounded in his chest with every step closer to home, hope and dread waging war within him. Would his mom and dad still be okay? Would he find them barricaded inside, safe from the madness? When he finally saw his house, a modest bungalow with a red door, he slowed his pace, his muscles protesting the sudden stop. The lights were on, and the door was ajar. Jace's heart sank. He approached with caution, his senses heightened, ready for anything. As he pushed the door open, the sight that greeted him was one of chaos and destruction. The living room was a maelstrom of overturned furniture, broken glass, and a smear of crimson that led to the kitchen. The smell of fear and blood hung heavy in the air. He found his parents huddled in the corner, backs against the fridge, their faces etched with terror. They looked up as he entered, and the relief in their eyes was palpable. "Jace," his mom whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, thank God." His dad, a man who had never shown fear in his life, had tears in his eyes as he hugged his son. They had survived the night, but the battle was far from over. The infection had taken their city, their school, their sense of security. Now, it was up to them to fight for their lives and the lives of those they loved. They had to find a way to make it through the day, to find Jaden and Chase, and to uncover the truth about what had happened to their world. The nightmare was just beginning to unfold, and they were all caught in its deadly embrace.